Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Throne of Heaven in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 11, Belief. Family trouble is always one of the hardest things to deal with, but if you let it get to you, then you'll never achieve anything. Ichigo startled at the sudden voice in his head, then realized what was going on, and drew his sword, eyeing the blade as he said, letting his annoyance show in his voice. How is the way I deal with my father any of your business? The sword sent a sense of disdainful amusement at him as Sode no Shirayuki's voice replied, completely undeterred. You wanted us to learn about each other, to work together better. Are you going to complain now that I'm making an effort at it? Ichigo let out a long breath, but he could see that the sword spirit had a point, and to be honest, he could use a sounding board to sort out the mess within his mind. So it was that, instead of another smart-ass remark, he found himself answering, tiredly. I suppose not. It's just, I don't know, weird, I guess. For so long I thought that what happened to my mother was my fault, and in part it was, but not as much as I thought. And yet, I can't just say that none of it was, either, nor can I throw all the blame on my father either. He might have known and didn't warn me, he might even be the reason that Hollow was there, but it's not like he gave the Hollow marching orders or anything. It's just such a mess, and I don't really know how to feel about it all, anymore. That's not strange in any way. Do you really need to feel in any way in particular? Can't you just accept that these events leave you confused, and leave it at that? No, I cannot. Most of my life, I've lived knowing that my mom died because of me, because I acted without thinking. Except now it turns out I was wrong, that wasn't the reason at all. So you have no reason to feel guilty then? Is that really something to worry over so much? It's not that. I mean, I guess I'll feel less guilty, but I stopped caring about that a long time ago. I just resolved myself to avoid diving into dangerous situation without need because of it, but maybe I was wrong. Would you, though? It seems to me that you've been throwing yourself into dangerous situations anyway all the time. You just got out of a fight a few hours ago, didn't you? That's different. I'm not helping Rukia out of any goodwill, it's to protect my family as well as everybody else. I see. Is that why your friends were so ready to join you in this? Because they knew that you wouldn't help anybody unless it was word-threatening? Ichigo smiled at this, and then frowned. Sure, jumping on this reasoning would be easy, but you don't think that's the actual reason, do you? Why wouldn't I? Only because your friend that you rushed so desperately to save said that you'd willingly do all you could to protect her and the others? Surely that can't be enough reason, can it? Okay, you've proved that you're smart. What's the point of that? The point is that you already put yourself in danger for the benefit of others. It doesn't really matter how much you want to pretend you don't, you do. So, if all that's gonna happen because of this revelation is that you'll keep doing what you already were, but no longer need to come up with self-rationalizations as to why you do it, I do not see what the problem is. Ichigo wasn't sure what to answer to that, but before he could think about it any longer, Ririka emerged from the door and said to him, in a clearly annoyed tone. Hey, Yukio has woken up, and is about to bring your friends back, in case you care to be there for it. Has it already been 2 hours? 3, actually. It's why I spoke up. Your brooding was reaching Byakuya's levels, and that's never good. Who's Byakuya? Somebody Rukia knows. You can ask her about it, but she won't want to answer. Ichigo was left perplexed by that, but the mention of Rukia did bring something to mind, so he chased after Ririka, who was already heading back, and stopped her by asking, letting his annoyance show. And what about Rukia and Ishida? I need you to return them to normal as well. The redhead turned to him and started, matching his annoyed tone with her own. Look, I told you already. That was when the other 3 Fullbringers left the house. Yukio was limping and clearly still out of sort, supported by Giriko, while Jinjo came out as the last. He glared at Ichigo, then turned to his younger companion. Come on, get everybody out of there, both Jackie and the other 2. The blonde boy nodded, then pulled out the portable console and fiddled with the buttons on it for a few moments, until the air rippled and then an opening in space formed. A few moments later, Orium, Chad and Jackie stumbled out of it, and upon looking at that, Ichigo realized that Chad seemed to be able to perceive him now, while Orium's spiritual power seemed to have doubled somehow while she was inside it. The girl smiled as she saw him, and then hurried forward to hug him. Ichigo. You didn't got hurt then. He actually had been when facing Jinjo the first time, but he supposed such minor wounds had healed by now, and either way, his health was the last thing he was worried about now. I'm fine. What about you? Did you got hurt? What happened? Oh, it's all fine. I became a superhero. And Jackie, who looks mean but isn't really all that much, told us how they aren't bad guys, that they were trying to open a portal to go see their loved ones in the afterlife and called the monsters by mistake. So there's no need to fight her, is there? Ichigo watched Orium in absolute confusion for a moment, then his gaze immediately went to Jinjo who, he found, was watching Jackie with a furious expression, while she looked apologetic. It took him a moment to realize why, and then he gently let go of Orium, which required actually removing her arms from him, as she didn't seem to want to break the hug, before turning toward Jinjo as he said. So, which is it, Jinjo? Were you trying to make the Shinigami come to you, or were you trying to get to Soul Society? The dark-haired man glared and said, in a dark tone. That's none of your business, after all, you're not a Shinigami, right? That's what Ashine said. Why should you care what I plan to do with Soul Society? It's not going to harm you anyway. Because I think I get it now. You didn't tell all of the truth to me, but your friend didn't say the whole truth to Orium either. I think that your plan is to find a way to open a road to Soul Society and then drag an army of hollows directly there, with the help of your friend the thief, so that you both can have your revenge. That makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? Jinjo let out a long breath at that, and said, almost seraphic. So it does. And again I ask, why should you do anything about it? It's not you who's gonna get hurt, in fact you'll get hurt if you get in the way, but if you don't rush into metal, neither you nor the people you care about will be in any danger. Just ignore us, and all you care about will stay safe. Ichigo stood still there as Jinjo finished his speech, and an image flashed about his eyes, the image of himself, rushing across a raining street, his desire to act causing the death of his mother. Except now he knew it had been a lack of action by part of his father, to cause it, and then he realized that it, too, wasn't right. He chuckled, lowering his head as he did, and said, You know, if you'd told me this just a few hours ago, I probably would have accepted it. I can see why my father says that you know how to get to people. But the fact of the matter is, you ruined every chance you ever had of that working. Did I now? For years, I thought it was my fault that my mom died, because I rushed into things I shouldn't have worried about instead of staying where I was. And then you tried to make me quarrel with my father by saying that it was his fault, but it wasn't. He raised his head, glaring at a surprised Jinjo, and concluded. It was yours. If you'd not summoned the hollow in the first place, it never would have been around to hurt my mom, or anybody else. And if I let you go on to do what you plan to, a ton more people would get hurt. You say it wouldn't hurt me, but that's stupid. You can't know it, and neither can I. Damage ripples out, from whomever you hurt first to everybody else. But I can know that if I stop you now, nobody else will get hurt from your actions again. So that's what I'm going to do. Jinjo let out a long breath there, and answered. I see. I suppose I did make you a promise when we last met, didn't I? And then, in a moment, Jinjo's hand went to his pendant, transforming it into a sword in a flash even as he shouted, in a hurry. Giriko, trap him now. Ichigo's eyes widened as he drew his sword and turned toward the middle-aged man to counteract his attack, only to find that the man wasn't attacking him. Instead, he'd whipped out a pocket watch by its chain and smashed it into the wall of Ichigo's house. For a moment he expected the watch to break, but instead it bounced back, and the man answered smartly. Done, Ishine's whole house, and everybody inside it, are within time's life for the next 2 hours. Jinjo grinned at that, and shot back. Good, that's more than enough to wrap this up. After all, it's 5 against 1. Let's go. And with that, Jinjo charged forward. This time, however, Ichigo didn't wait, instead releasing Sode no Shirayuki immediately even as he dodged with a backward jump. Jinjo followed him into the air, while from down there Jackie shouted. Jinjo, stop. This is a mistake. Oh, why don't you shut up, we have him. That was Ririka, and Ichigo turned in the direction to her voice to see a multitude of her weird heart-shaped projectiles heading for him, the same who had took down Rukia and Ishida, and he could feel Jinjo closing his retreat, but before he could even think of a way out, suddenly a huge blast of blue light shot from the ground, completely catching all of the projectiles within and pulverizing that. Every Fullbringer and Ichigo himself turned to the source of the blast with surprise, except for Jackie, who was charging at it, because she clearly already knew where it had come, from Chad. Ichigo's friend offered him a nod and thumb up, and then sent another blast at Ririka, forcing the sniper on the defensive. Ichigo saw something like long sleeves forming over his arm for a barest fraction of a second before the blast went, and seemed ready to completely ignore Jackie, which was because, as it turned out, when the woman's heel-dropping kick went for his head, a triangular barrier was there, stopping the attack cold and causing Jackie to skip back with a curse as Orium said, steel in her voice and expression in a way Ichigo had never seen before. It's just as Ichigo said, you gotta stop trying to hurt everybody. That's mean. Ichigo grinned at that, then let himself fall rather than ducking to avoid a swipe from Jinjo's sword, which then allowed him to charge upwards. Jinjo quickly darted out of the way, but Ichigo pressed as he said, finding his confidence. Not as easy as you thought it would be, is it? Jinjo quickly stepped backwards even as his sword started to wrap itself in electricity, and Ichigo jumped way upwards to avoid the following up blast of electricity which let a huge stench of ozone in the air. Ichigo had little doubt that if that hit him, he would be out cold, as he shouted back. You guys, focus on the two on the ground, keep them out of my hairs. Then he turned his glare on Ichigo and added, almost as a growl. I'll deal with you by myself. And once you're dead, your friends will be too. And then he immediately charged. Ichigo charged too, but when their swords clashed, Jinjo unleashed the same explosion of wind he had used in their other fight, sending Ichigo flying backwards. Luckily, between being in midair and being using Ho-Ho to do it, while he was sent far further, he didn't get anywhere near the same damage from it. It did, however, let him reeling in on the defensive, as Jinjo used the few seconds it took Ichigo to recover his bearings to come charging, continuing to use his explosive impact ability to make it impossible for Ichigo to parry or initiate any sort of counter-attack. He glanced under his feet as he tried to see if he could ask for help from his friends, but he saw immediately that wouldn't work. While they didn't look in danger right now, it seemed like things were at a stalemate. Apparently, while Chad's blasts were powerful enough to obliterate Ririka's offense and keep her from doing much, they weren't so fast that she couldn't dodge, and Chad clearly could only fire one at a time, which made it impossible for him to work on any of the others. Luckily, Orium was, somehow, keeping the other three Fullbringers in check all by herself. Her shield kept stopping Jackie. The woman could apparently push it back, but the moment she had to stop to recover her footing, the wall would move forward again, keeping her under control, while she had something small orbiting around the other two enemies. Ichigo couldn't see any details at a distance, only that they seemed small glowing balls of light, but he could see that, whenever Yukio or Giriko tried to do something, one of the lights would smack into them, apparently packing the power of a solid punch, and stop them from acting. Still, even with that, they were clearly not inflicting serious damage, and while Jackie seemed to be tiring herself slamming into the wall, Ichigo saw that Orium also looked like every hit the wall took made her sag a little, and indeed, she also sagged a bit, if less, whenever one of the glowing orbs hit the other two Fullbringer. And he could feel Chad's spiritual power slowly going down with every shot he fired, meaning that he, too, was on a time limit. Then he had no time to check his friends, as Jinjo suddenly made a wide swing that sent a volley of spikes at Ichigo. He managed to wave his own sword in front of himself to create a screen of ice to stop them with, but Jinjo didn't stop, continuing to repeat his attack and forcing Ichigo even more on the defense than he had before. And, Ichigo suddenly realized as the attacks started coming from slightly different angles, he was being boxed in. Jinjo was using the Fullbringer air travel trick's weakness, the necessity to be constantly on the move, to his own advantage, while using Ho-Ho's own ability to offer a more stable stand combined with the fact that the Ice Sword no Shirayuki created was anchored in place as weaknesses. Ichigo tried to dodge upwards, but Jinjo was quick to counter with two more volleys, and Ichigo was just about ready to jump into the attack head-on, while quite suddenly, a giant globe of glowing light smashed into his opponent, sending the Fullbringer crashing into the ground while Ichigo used the reprieve to get out of the trap he'd built for himself, smiling as Rukia's voice said, sounding smug. "I didn't interrupt anything important, did I?" "No, I think you're just in time actually." He then glanced at her, and his smile was replaced by a frown when he saw the condition she was in. She was bonelessly slumped into a chair made of Ishida's slides melded together, practically strapped into it by them, and while she waved in his direction, she looked like she had otherwise next to no mobility. She didn't look like she could get into battle in her conditions, but then, she'd also just got him out of a tricky situation, so he mentioned, worried. "You're not looking too good. You're sure you should be getting into fights? And where is Ishida, anyway?" Rukia spoke, but her mouth didn't move, rather, she made a gesture with her fingers before the sound of her words formed directly into his own ear. "He's around, and I have a plan. I need a few minutes with the redhead, then I'll be fine. Think you can hold off their leader until then?" Ichigo looked at Jinjo, who was staring at Rukia in utter confusion, and answered with a grin. "Yeah, now that I know what I'm up against, I think I'll be able to handle him for a little bit." "That's good, do your thing then, I'll be back soon." And with that, Rukia dashed forward. As she passed by Rukia, Orium took a moment to wave at her in greeting, and Rukia shouted back to her in chat. "Orium, Sato, I'm taking down the blonde kid, and then the redhead. Be ready for it." Yukio glared at that and shouted, annoyed. "Hey! Don't just think I'm that easy a target, you dash." Before he could finish, the glowing globe orbiting him smashed him straight in the mouth, sending him reeling. Before he could recover, Rukia made 3 quick motions with her hands, a large circular one, then a downward motion, then a closing fist, and a circular golden barrier formed around Yukio, then a huge pillar of light slammed on him from above, taking advantage of how boxed in he was, sending him collapsing to the ground, and then a set of rings formed around his whole body, and immediately sprouted spikes that anchored them to the ground. Rukia didn't even stop as she then charged toward Ririka, which allowed Chad to refocus his blasts on keeping Giriko on the defensive, and Orium to draw away all of her glowing globes to finally go on the offensive against Jackie. Satisfied that the others had it in hand, Ichigo charged toward a mostly recovered Jinjo. He had to figure out a way past his exploding power. As long as the man had that, engaging him in melee would be impossible, and if he sent him flying again, that would just be enough for Ichigo to be put on the back foot again by the man's long-ranged attacks, something he had no answer for. He almost felt envious of Ishida for a moment, for having ranged options when he didn't. "I can't really give you a ranged option, but I think I have something you can use." "You're a martial artist, aren't you?" Ichigo nodded, not seeing how that would help anything, at least until Sode no Shirayuki elaborated. "My power is to draw in heat from my surroundings, that's why the ice can't move and stays fixed, but it's not limited to just the sword in your hands. We're connected, which makes us almost a single being. If you channel my power along your body, your every limb can act as if it was part of me." That caused him to grin. He definitely could use that, but before he could think it over any further, Jinjo was in front of him, sword swinging. Ichigo didn't even try to stop it, instead dodging under the attack even as he went for a low sweeping kick at his opponent's leg. Jinjo dodged, but Ichigo moved upwards and onward, thrusting his sword forward. Jinjo sidestepped that, but not fast enough, and was forced to go into a hard block against Ichigo's follow-up slash at his head. "You're done for, Shinigami boy." Then the sword exploded, sending Ichigo rocketing backwards as he'd expected, and, as Jinjo had not expected, he was dragged along as well, and since it was his plan, Ichigo was able to slash the connection of ice he'd formed between their legs when he'd stepped inside Jinjo's guard, and just as they were about to crash into a wall, he used his sword to sever the connection and the superior footwork granted by his ho-ho to correct course, while the Fullbringer simply smashed into the time. Stopped building at full speed. Jinjo was glowing a bit, a clear sign he'd used the same reinforcing technique Chad knew to avoid getting overly hurt, but he clearly looked out of sort from the hit, so Ichigo pressed for advantage, charging forward, or at least, he tried to. Jinjo had his huge sword slammed into the ground to support his weight, but the moment he saw Ichigo charging, the sword seemed to bulge out somehow, and then a sudden eruption of weird fleshy eggs erupted from the ground like a multitude of geysers. Forcing Ichigo back, one hit a nearby lamppost and exploded with a ton more power than the wind explosions from before had, practically disintegrating it, while the ones that simply fall back onto the street created huge craters wherever they landed. He glared at Jinjo, who other than recovering his wind didn't seem in any way tense for using an attack that, Ichigo was sure, had to be lethal. He glanced back at his friends to ensure they were out of the line of fire for Jinjo's attacks, and found that they looked like not only were they safe, but they were actually holding their own quite well. Jackie was having trouble getting close to Chad, her own lack of ranged attacks putting her in a similar situation as Ichigo had been, while Orium seemed to actually have her opponent truly on the ropes. The vertical shield that had been protecting her before was now standing horizontally, like a platform, and she was standing over it. The three glowing orbs she had were now orbiting her, instead of her opponent, and were making so in very large circles, so that each one smacked into Giriko as part of their movement, and with 3 instead of 2, the frequency of hits was such that he had not time to recover his ground and go on the offensive, and whenever he tried to step backwards, Orium's shield simply flew forwards and the trajectory of her orbiting lights readjusted itself, keeping up the pressure unrelentingly. Rukia, meanwhile, seemed to just be taunting Ririka. She was clearly sliding around on the platforms of Ishida's sliding paths, while the Quincy had yet to reveal itself. There was no denying that their cooperative assault was working wonders. While Rukia seemed able to only use one arm, the fact that she could focus only on that due to not needing to divide her focus on dodging properly was letting her pelt her opponent with a multitude of spells, summoning barriers by the dozen so that all of her shots were stopped, as well as repeatedly firing those huge glowing spheres to keep Ririka on the defense. But she was also gloating as he did, which was weird. Rukia hadn't really seemed like the type to trash-talk her opponent, but that was exactly what she was doing. "Come on, little girl, is that all you have to show for you? You're not ever gonna hurt me with such pathetic attacks. Shut up. Just shut up and stop running, you coward. You're not any better than me, you can't hit me any more than I can, and I'm not little at all. Can't I?" Suddenly, Ririka reacted as if she'd just being smacked straight in the face, and as her eyes widened in surprise, a very tiny bruise forming on her cheek, just under the eye, she suddenly had to cross her arms over her face, before she started to be peppered by a multitude of attacks, each similarly miniature-sized, yet clearly still hurting and, more importantly, when Ririka tried to avoid them, they kept slamming into her, clearly much too fast for her to stop, although Ichigo did notice that, while the attack was going on, Rukia's arm had gone inert. She clearly couldn't cast her spell and launch this attack at the same time. That was when Rukia said again, in a mocking tone. "At this size they inflict next to no damage, since they have no real spiritual mass, but they're also much faster. You could dodge the normal-sized arrows, but when they're practically invisible and you can't see how they're being fired. Not a chance. It might take a few thousand cuts, but how does it feel to know that you'll be taken down by your own power being turned against you? You think that's gonna be enough to beat me? My power is my own, I can defeat it just fine." Then, clearly wanting to prove her point, she let out a flurry of shots from her gun, and they looked different. Instead of the usual pink and full heart, they looked a darker red shade, and empty inside. They impacted what looked like several arrows, and indeed as they changed size, the projectile became slower, enough that Ririka dodged them upwards. She let out another flurry to stop the follow-up as she shouted, triumphant. "See? I can defeat my power just fine." "You're right, you can. You have my apologies then." Ririka stopped, as a second Rukia had suddenly appeared in front of her, and this one looked like she had full control of her body, stretching herself for a moment before she continued, her expression very serious. "You really were a tricky opponent to take down. So take this as a sign of respect, okay?" Then, before Ririka could react, Rukia made a rotatory movement with her hand, forming a small, very dense sphere of glowing fire on top of her index finger, which she then closed within her first, and when she opened again, palm open and facing her opponent, a flurry of 5 spheres of the same size flew forward from it and repeatedly smashed into the Fullbringer, each one exploding on impact. The girl had her defense up and thus wasn't seriously wounded by the attacks, but the repeated shocks knocked her unconscious fairly soon after having sent her smashing into the ground. Satisfied that Rukia would have this solved soon, Ichigo returned his attention to Jinjo who, he saw, had also been following the two girls' clash while he kept his offensive of exploding eggs up. When Ririka was slammed into the ground, he let out an annoyed grunt and refocused on Ichigo, his tone very dark. "Alright, I'm done with this. I'm gonna murder you all, Kurosake, and you are dying first." Then he raised his sword, which glowed purple, and Ichigo could feel the charge of power within it spiking. Before he could charge forward, a wave of power exploded out of the blade, and he did the only thing he could, moving backwards in a zigzagging motion while waving his sword as much as possible, creating several walls of ice as huge as he could make them. He then watched with dread as, after the first wall shattered stopping the first wave of ice, Jinjo started to fire wave after wave after wave, letting out several per second, which meant that he could destroy the walls faster than Ichigo could make them. That was when Orium landed next to him, the platform disappearing underneath her as she said, "Ichigo, I can protect the others with my barriers, you need to go there and stop him." He was surprised for a moment, but then nodded to his friend and jumped into the air, pushing his shunpo as fast as he could as he saw Orium set up 2 barriers in front of herself, and he smiled as he saw that the cutting waves failed to breach past the front one, although he did see that it was slammed back as far as the second, before Orium pushed it up again, entering in another push and pull fight as the one she'd been with Jackie, but against a much stronger opponent. Which meant, he knew, that she wouldn't last long. But she had done enough. Ichigo plunged down on Jinjo, forcing him to interrupt his waves to block his attacks. The man growled and shouted, "I'm done with you, Shinigami. I'll enjoy killing you once you're left without your sword, your lot are useless without those." Ichigo could easily have counteracted that Rukia didn't look helpless at all to him despite having lost her Zanpakuto, but he didn't have the time as a multitude of tentacles erupted from Jinjo's sword, wrapping around Sode no Shirayuki to grab away at it with a strength that Ichigo could tell he'd only be able to withstand for a moment, but he grinned, for that was all he needed. He pushed out all of his Zanpakuto's power at once, freezing both the tentacles and the sword itself, and when Jinjo's eyes widened at seeing his sword trapped, Ichigo shot back. "So, what about you? Can you do anything without your sword?" Jinjo let out a veritable roar as he let go of the sword with one hand to swing a punch at Ichigo. Unable to actually block or dodge, Ichigo did the first thing that came to mind, copying Chad's technique once again to push all of his Ryutsu outside of his own body like an armor. It felt weird, doing it when he had no actual body to reinforce, and he made sure to note to himself to experiment on it later, but all that mattered was that it worked, Jinjo's fist letting a bruise on his cheek but otherwise being no more hurtful than a dozen other times he'd gotten punched, while the man looked at him in disbelief as he said, shocked, "How, you're a Shinigami, why can you use a Fullbringer's ability? Where did you learn?" "From a friend." Then, without giving him any more time, Ichigo kneed him right in the belly, and apparently he'd been so shocked as to have lowered his guard, which meant he was sent rocketing back, and most importantly, that he lost grip completely on his trapped sword, which was left trapped and attached to Ichigo's own. A moment later, Kiriko was next to Jinjo, with an unconscious Jackie slung over his shoulder. 3 of Rukia's glowing spheres of fire head toward him, but he swung his clock by its chain as if it was a whip, and each of the 3 spheres he touched was frozen in time, and then he was sent bowling over by a blast of blue energy courtesy of Chad. The 2 Fullbringers got back on their feet, and Kiriko said to Jinjo, his tone pleading, "We need to retreat, we can't take them down without help, not right now." The Fullbringer leader scoffed in disgust, but despite this was apparently in agreement as he said, "All right then, but this isn't over." Then the 2 ran away. Ichigo was ready to pursue but Rukia appeared next to him and said, "Serious? We don't know where they're going, they might lead us into another trap. We underestimated them last time, and we're almost wiped out, we need to play this more carefully than that." Ichigo let out a long breath, then nodded, sealing away Sode no Shirayuki, which caused the ice around the swords to melt so that Jinjo's sword fell to the ground, where it immediately turned back into his cross pendant. Ichigo handed it to Rukia, then turned to where Ririka and Yukio were both being held by some of Rukia's restraints, while the other Rukia sat slumped into its chair of glowing energy, and was using her only working hand to point at Ririka with what Ichigo would almost say were annoyed gestures. "What's going on there?" "Oh, right. That's a Jigai, me and Ishida got miniaturized, so we had to make do with that until I could trick Ririka into making me grow up back to my true size. Ishida is still inside and still small, and I think he'd want us to actually move up and bring him back to his true size." Ichigo nodded, and they all moved to the fake Rukia. Once there, it didn't take long to wake up Ririka and coax her into returning Ishida to a normal size. He checked himself over, then nodded in thanks to Rukia and asked, looking at their prisoners. "So, what now?" Rukia glared at the captured Fullbringers and answered. "Now, we have them tell us what's really going on, but not here. I had Urahara work on getting in contact with my captain while I was here helping you. If he did his job, we can have his help in figuring out what we should do next." Everybody nodded at that, and they quickly headed to Urahara's shop, carrying the prisoners along. Once there, they found that Urahara had put up a big wall-sized screen on the back room, from which a man with friendly eyes was smiling at the group and said, as she entered, "Ah, it is a pleasure to meet you all. Kisuke was just telling me about how good a team Rukia had put together, and I must say that I am proud of her work." Ichigo had noticed Rukia visibly relaxing the moment she'd seen her captain's face on the screen, and he saw now that his words of pride clearly pleased her as she moved next to the big screen and made the introductions. "Captain, allow me to present you Ichigo Kurosake, Urayu Ishida, Oriya and Yasutara Sato. They have helped me more than I can say, and are all exceptional people. And team, allow me to introduce you to the captain of the 12th Division of Godai 13, and the smartest man I know, Sozuki-san." The curly-haired, bespectacled man offered another friendly smile as he waved and said, "I look forward to working together with you all." Chapter 12, Plot. Aizen listened attentively as Rukia explained what they'd learned from the captured Fullbringer, looking thoughtful at the end as he commented, "I was honestly not expecting Shinji to seek allies and plan to mount an all-out assault on Soul Society. As brazen as he is, that seems excessive, even for him." Urahara spoke up then, a frown on his face as he asked, "Do you think he might be aware of our search for him, and this might be a reaction to being cornered? Lashing out in the hope that'll make us stop chasing him?" "It is a possibility, but I am doubtful. You have done an exceptional job of staying hidden. I would be surprised if anybody but me knew of your team's actions." Urahara seemed to consider that, then asked, "Maybe the spy discovered it on your end, Captain, and passed him the information." Ichigo jumped in at that, hoping that he might be able to get some clarifications on what the actual plan of the Shinigami was. "Which spy?" Aizen turned to him and said, in a bit of a tired tone. "Shinji has allies here in Soul Society. One of these is the 3rd Division's captain, Jinichi Maru, we are sure of it. However, all the evidence we had of it disappeared before we could present it to the Captain Commander, and in the process Captain Yoriyuki was framed instead. The only way this could have happened was if there was a spy within the 12th Division who handed off the information to him." Rukia looked morose at that and said, in an annoyed tone, "I'll bet you it turns out the spy is Mayuri, as I've been saying for the longest time." Aizen frowned at that, but then his expression turned more neutral and he said, peaceably, "While I acknowledge that Lieutenant Mayuri is an unpleasant person to be around, Rukia, he is also the one I keep under the strictest supervision, since I need to ensure he confines his research to ethical pursuits, which is why it would be counterproductive for a spy to so openly display their less savory inclinations. I remain of my idea that the lieutenant is in fact a decoy the real spy uses to keep us distracted while they work in the shadows. Again, I understand your dislike for him, but we cannot let our personal feelings cloud our judgment." Rukia nodded, although Ichigo could see she wasn't happy about it, but that was when Urahara jumped in, genial. "Well, regardless of who the spy is, could they have found out about us in some manner, Captain?" Aizen looked thoughtful for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. "I exclude it. I have been very careful not to let on that I am in constant contact with you all, which is why I limit the chats we can have only to those absolutely indispensable. Although I do have had some questions from people that wanted to know about Rukia, Momo in particular was concerned." He paused, then turned a wry smile at Rukia as he added, "And Captain Yukitake wants to know how long it will take for me to give my evaluation on your Kido skills, Rukia. He thinks I should already have had the time to evaluate you and submit my judgment." Rukia let out a groan at that and answered, "You haven't yet, right?" "No, but I expect that next time, he will show up with your brother in tow, and it will be much harder to keep delaying at that point." Rukia nodded in a morose manner, then her eyes widened and she said, suddenly energetic, "Well, you could just say I need more practice under you and dash." "No, I will not lie and say you are lacking abilities in which you excel. Rukia, I understand you have your reasons, and you know I am sympathetic to them or I wouldn't have accepted your transfer in the first place, but you cannot keep hiding forever. Taking your time to make sure you do everything right is the correct way to handle things, but after a certain point, you need to make your move, else you might as well forfeit the game. And if you wanted to forfeit the game, you would not have joined the GODI 13 in the first place. Rukia frowned, clearly unhappy as she answered. But if you send the letter, the head captain would require that I accept the promotion. And, what of the mission here? I can't keep doing this if I have to go back to the 13th, can I? Aizen smiled bemusedly at that. Are you saying that you would delay the success of the mission just to keep from having to have a discussion with Captain Yukatake and your brother regarding your future? Of course not. But... She trailed off, clearly unsure over what she should say, which caused Aizen to smile in an understanding manner. I think that my latest talk with Captain Yukatake should have gained us about 4 more months. I trust you should be able to have the mission wrapped up by then, especially now that you finally have a solid lead, right? Rukia's shoulders sagged, but then she shook her head, straightening and steeling herself as she said, I will do it, Captain, you can count on me. Urahara clapped his hands at that and said, amused. Right, so I think we can move to interrogating the prisoners then, seeing if you can get something more out of them than we did, Captain. Ishida spoke then, with, Ichigo noticed, a certain edge to his voice. Captain Aizen, what does he mean by that? I might not approve of their actions and fought them, but only because of necessity. I won't condone any torture. Aizen seemed surprised at that, then smiled in understanding and said, You need not worry, Mr. Ishida, that was never our intention. Urahara merely meant that my superior perceptive ability would help me more easily spot any lie they tried to feed to us. How so? Well, you certainly know of Shikai, I would assume. Yes, it's when Shinigami call upon their Zanpakuto to release their inner power. Exactly. My Zanpakuto, Kyuga Suijutsu, is of the mind type, and whenever I release it, I gain the power to perceive anything that anybody who the sword has touched after its release is perceiving. Ichigo frowned and commented. That doesn't seem a very effective power, compared with what Sode no Shirayuki does. Aizen's smile became one of amusement as he said. You would be surprised at how useful it can be to know which of your feints are going to work and which aren't, and it is actually not that difficult to guess what an opponent will do next when you can feel their very emotions at the same time they do. But that is not really relevant right now, since my sword cannot reach our targets through this connection. However, in order for me to properly interpret the data it sends to my brain, Kyuga Suijutsu, when in its released state, also increases all of my senses, as well as my ability to process and understand information. Urahara sighed wistfully at that and commented. See, now that's a power worth having. I'd be able to do so much more with my research if I had a sword that literally makes me smarter. Aizen chuckled at that and shot back, with clear fondness. Come on now, surely having all the time you could possibly need to carry out your experiments is just as good, if not better. I don't know. It's true it allows me to try and retry anything as much as I want, but if I just can't get the right idea, or figure out the proper hypothesis to work off of, no amount of time is gonna help. I rather think that you are so used to taking advantage of your power that you take it for granted, Kisuke, but I suppose you would say the same about me, right? That caused the blonde man to chuckle awkwardly, which was quite the difference from how he usually acted when training Ichigo. Before the two Shinigami could continue with their clearly friendly banter any further, however, Ishida spoke up again. So, if I understood correctly, you were about to say that, thanks to your expanded senses, you'd be able to understand if they were lying to you even at this distance, is that correct, Captain Aizen? The man nodded. Indeed. While not as effective as if I had them under the direct effect, since nobody can lie to me when I have that advantage, I still believe that my enhanced perception should still enable me to spot any falsehood they tried to feed us. It is at least worth trying, I believe. Everybody agreed at that and Rukia said, serious. Let's try it then. Orium raised an hand at that, almost like she would in the classroom, and when Aizen's expression turned questioning, she asked him, sounding apologetic. Mr. Aizen, do we all have to listen to your questioning of them? I suppose that is unnecessary, we can call you back in once we are finished with it. Ishida opted to stay behind to oversee the interrogation, but Ichigo was more curious about Orium and Chad's new abilities. He was sure that Rukia would tell him everything he needed to know, anyway. As they headed out of the back room, Ichigo asked Orium, with some curiosity. So, you've gotten spiritual powers now? How did that happen? We became Fullbringers. It was Chad who had answered, so it was to him that Ichigo turned. His friend then explained, in his usual slow and measured tone. The woman, Jackie, explained that the power of Fullbring comes from feeling strong emotions, and pushing them into an item you feel strongly attached to. We just did that. Orium jumped in at that, adding. Sato is very good at this, he learned it all from one explanation. I sort of managed it by accident, but it's really cool. Look, I'll introduce you. Then she closed her eyes, focusing for a moment, and 6 glowing orbs of light formed around her head, except that, now he could look at them up close. Ichigo saw they were 6 small fairies. They waved and spoke together, with a voice Ichigo could only barely hear. We are Shun Shun Rika, ready to fight for Orium. Ichigo nodded, then commented. It seems similar to how Zanpakuto works, in a way. Hardly. Ichigo was surprised by that, and so no Shirayuki explained, sounding smug. A Zanpakuto is a separate soul from your own, with its own powers born of its nature. We are independent and offer our power at our own convenience. These items the Fullbringer use, on the other hand, are empowered by their own soul. They are still codependent, and without the wielder, they have no real power of their own. They would never be able to fuse with their owner spirit to create a superior soul capable of accessing the combined power of Bankai, for example. They're just a shallow copy, nowhere near the level of power a real Zanpakuto grants. Ichigo was about to ask what Bankai was, but before he could, Orium interrupted his thoughts by adding, sounding excited. It's so fun. Each of them can control time around themselves, but if I have them working together they can cover an entire area. I only tried it up to 4, but I wonder if I can make some more interesting effects with different combinations. Ichigo chuckled at that. He was a good enough student, but Orium was the 3rd best in their year and, for some reason, a real monster in more math-oriented courses, and answered with a smile. It's good that you are having ideas about how to use your power. I'm just glad you'll be able to protect yourselves now. Chad nodded in understanding, while Orium smashed her fist into her open palm and said, Yup, we can. And we can protect you too, and each other. We're gonna be the best Ghostbuster team ever, and Tatsuki is gonna be so glad I can fight now. She always complained that I should learn to defend myself too. Then Orium's eyes widened and she asked, suddenly anxious. Oh no, Tatsuki. Why isn't she here? Did she get hurt? She was fine when we got trapped. Ichigo let out a long breath, and answered. She did got hurt helping me fight the Jinjo guy, but I brought her to Dad, and he made sure she was fine. I guess she just got trapped with my dad when the Fullbringer time froze the clinic. They should be freed by now. Maybe when we are done here you can come with me, show her your new powers. Oh, that's a great idea. I can't wait to introduce Shun Shun Rika to her. We already know your best friend, Orium. You do? Of course we do, we were with you the whole time even if we were asleep. Ichigo watched in fascination as the discussion devolved into a silly conversation between Orium and the fairies, which he gathered lived within her hairpins, about whether they were spying on her all the time, until Chad distracted him by asking. When we speak to Tatsuki, do you know what to tell her? About what? Training. She wants to be involved, and she'll need spiritual powers of her own to do it. I didn't think of that. He really hadn't. Which was silly, since he and Tatsuki had been speaking of it just a few hours ago, before this whole debacle with Jinjo's team started. He really should figure out some plans for it. And now that you are thinking of it, do you have any ideas to suggest her? Honestly, I'm not sure. I thought I would just get Rukia to give you the same thing I have so you can walk out of your body and we all train together, but she wouldn't have a Zanpakuto like I do, and Rukia said that learning to cast spells like she does takes a lot of time. Seeing how strong you became, maybe she should train as a Fullbringer with the 2 of you? Or maybe I can ask Ishida to help her, if she's more suited to the Quincy arts. I don't know that I can teach much about how Fullbringers fight, Ichigo. I know very little of it. I saw that guy you were fighting walking on midair, but I wouldn't know how to do that, for example. Ichigo frowned. He hadn't considered that. Still, he could at least help Chad with this. I don't know much either, but I was watching how Jinjo did it, and he was pushing Ryotsu only out of his feet, but in a different manner than you do with the full body defense you can put up. Maybe try experimenting with that, pushing your Ryotsu out of a single body part, see if that help. Chad frowned, and experimentally pushed a puff of Ryotsu out of his fist, then commented. Maybe. Awakening an item works by pushing the energy, Ryotsu, you said it's called? Pushing it inside the item. Maybe. Seeing that his friend was thinking it over, Ichigo added, hoping it might help. It's also the way you see ghosts. You're constantly emitting a very low amount of Ryotsu that bounces back from spiritual things and is collected back in your eyes. If you focus, you can send a stronger pulse that travels farther and deeper, giving you more information and a greater visual range. He demonstrated, letting out one of the pulses, which caused Chad to blink for a moment, before he copied, doing the same, except that, for some reason, his pulse traveled about twice as far as Ichigo, and felt a good bit more powerful too. He supposed it might just be Chad's natural inclination for the art. His friend nodded and said, I see. I think I might be able to work with this. Then he looked up at Ichigo and added. But I might not be able to train somebody else. I will try if you think it's the best path, but it'll be hard to teach somebody when I'm still learning myself. Ichigo could see the logic in it, and didn't complain. The mere fact that Chad was still willing to at least try was more than most other people would have wanted to do. Seeing that his friend was working on trying out his new suggestion, Ichigo refocused his attention to Orium, who seemed to be done making sure that the fairies wouldn't share any embarrassing details they'd happened to see while spending their time as her hair ornament, and was then happy to proceed introducing each of her fairies. Apparently, they all had differing personalities and interests, the only thing in common among them all being their desire to protect Orium. By the time Rukia showed up to call them back to Aizen, Ichigo was feeling better. The antics of Orium's fairies had helped with that, if nothing else, so he was better able to focus as Aizen explained what they'd learned. Apparently, what you surmised was mostly right. Jinjo has allied himself with Shinji, who used the Hujioku to alter the awakened item of the youngest member of their group, Yukio Voreben, so that he could open portals to Hueco Mundo. They are not yet able to aim it at Soul Society correctly, but in the meanwhile Jinjo was using it to grow in power by stockpiling hollow powers. The other Fullbringer, Ririka Dakugane, also gave us some information on the goals of their leader, Jinjo Kyujo. Apparently, he is after a specific Shinigami that wronged him in the past. They do not know the name, but Shinji was able to identify him from the description, and had promised to lead Mr. Kyujo to him once they are there. Sadly, Miss Dakugane wasn't able to repeat this description back to us, so we cannot do the same. Still, we also know that Shinji was planning to use the Fullbringer to cause confusion while he headed for me directly. Apparently revenge is what he is after, but he sold it to the Fullbringers as justice. He told them that I framed him. Urahara scoffed at that and offered, in an annoyed tone. Which is ridiculous. I fought him personally when he went to steal the Hujioku, was there when he used it on himself to make himself strong enough to survive against Yoroichi and escape, and all of that was after I'd personally found out about his crimes and exposed him. Aizen nodded at that, then went on. In any case, we are on a tight schedule. Miss Dakugane was of the opinion that Mr. Kyujo will contact Shinji soon, and when he does, we fear that, knowing we've tracked him down and with his one hope of being able to travel back to Soul Society thwarted by the fact that we hold Mr. Voreben, we fear that he'll just cut his losses and leave Karakura. Which puts us on quite the tight timer. Rukia smiled at that and commented, sounding smug. Luckily, Captain Aizen has come up with a plan for that. The man looked amused at Rukia's enthusiasm, then explained. I did nothing exceptional, I just suggested that we use bait to keep Shinji here. The idea was that we would let Miss Dakugane and Mr. Voreben go, while withholding their awakened items. This way, either Mr. Kyujo, to avoid losing the help Shinji promised him, will attack us himself to get the items back, hopefully not even letting Shinji know that we are on his tail, or at worst he will rope Shinji into the attack. And just as an insurance, when we let the two of them go, we will also tail them to Air Hideout, so that we can at least keep an eye on them and, if they seem to be hesitant, we can attack them directly. Rukia nodded and added, "Now that I know what I'm dealing with, I think I'd be good enough to follow them without being noticed." "That won't be necessary, I can do it much better." Ichigo turned at the new voice, as did everybody else. Aizen smiled ruefully at the sight, while Urahara grinned and Rukia looked ecstatic, looking at what looked like a very normal black cat wearing a red collar with a silver bell attached to it. "Captain Yoriyuki. You're back." The cat cocked its head to the side, then, faster than Ichigo's eyes could track, she was standing on midair just in front of Rukia, and gave her a small bop on the nose with its tail, except the way Rukia suddenly was holding it, it looked like it hurt quite more than one would expect. Then the cat spoke again, using a deep male voice as it said, "What have I said you about calling me that? You can never know when somebody with long-range hearing powers might be around, it could blow my cover if you just blurt out my name so openly." "Ah. I'm sorry, Cap, I mean, Mistress." The cat nodded. "That's better." Aizen had been smiling at the whole exchange, and then went on to say, "You're sure you're not going a bit overboard? I think at this point we are close enough that such extreme subterfuge should not be necessary anymore. It's exactly when you are the closest to the target that you need to exercise the most caution, the final steps are always the hardest. You wouldn't understand, you've never been Omnitsukido, but Urahara can confirm that I'm right, can't you, Kisuke?" The man grinned and shot back. "Well, you certainly never relented on us, that much I can confirm for sure." At this point, Ichigo felt that he could interject himself into the banter and ask, perplexed, "I thought the Captain Yoriyuki you spoke of to be a woman, not a talking cat, one that sounds male, at that." Suddenly, the cat was in front of Ichigo, and said, with a very cute expression on its muzzle, "Last warning. Don't call me that, it's dangerous. You shall refer to me as either mistress or goddess, whichever you like better, I'm not picky. And to answer the question, I'm undercover. My real body is that of a woman, changing the voice when in this form is an extra step to ensure security." Ichigo was skeptical of that. "And it works?" The cat raised an eyebrow, which was quite the unusual sight, then answered, "Come on, try your best to scan me, see if you can spot anything that would give away my disguise." Ichigo frowned, but nodded, and used all three of his detection methods at once. The strain was quite a lot, but he should have at least been able to sense the real spiritual power of Yoroichi, or at least some sign that it was hidden, with at least one of them. Yet all he could feel was a very normal cat, with no telling tale of being anything else. If he'd had to pick her out of a lineup of animals with his spiritual senses alone, he doubted he'd be able to do it. When he dropped his detection abilities and shook his head, Yoriyuki assumed a very satisfied expression, then turned back to Aizen and said, "All right then, it's decided. You let the two Fullbringer go, I follow them, and then we wait and see if they take the bait or not." Aizen nodded, then went on. "Very well. Now, I cannot keep this meeting going for too long, and we have already spent quite the amount of time here, so, unless there is something else. Actually, Captain Aizen, I was wondering if you could do anything to check over Ichigo's situation with the Owlswool? I know it's not the same as being able to check it over personally, but maybe if you saw it in action, you could tell us if there's any way to reverse the process." Aizen seemed surprised, but then nodded, turning his eyes toward Ichigo as he asked, "Mr. Kurosaki, how well can you use the Owlswool?" Ichigo pulled out the black sword, getting into a ready position as he answered. "Pretty well, I'd say. We had some trouble at first, but now we can speak with each other freely and even work together in combat the way a Shinigami and Zanpakuto are supposed to." Aizen seemed intrigued by that. "Oh? So the spirit of Sode no Shirayuki was able to resist you?" Ichigo shook his head. "No, quite the opposite. She has to obey anything I say that could be construed as an order, so I need to be careful about how I phrase my questions. I meant that we managed to find a common ground, so that she is now working to help me of her own free will, which makes us much more effective in combat." "I see. That is quite the interesting detail. And I am given to understand, from what Rukia reported, that you are also able to access her Shikai? I am. Show me, please. Ichigo nodded and performed the release routine, then, just to prove he was capable of it, he traced an arc in the air, leaving a thin strip of ice behind. Aizen nodded, eyebrows furrowed, and said, "It is as I thought then. The Ozwell absorbed the entire Zanpakuto connection and soul both, instead of simply copying the connection as it was intended to. Can it be reversed in any way that you can think of, Captain?" Aizen shook his head at Rukia's question and told her, sounding apologetic. "None that easily comes to mind, other than breaking the Ozwell itself. But I would not recommend doing that, as the backlash would certainly result in the death of Mr. Kurosaki. Maybe when you have successfully completed your mission, I could be able to take a journey to the mortal realm and examine what the connections is like personally. Using Kyuga Suijutsu on him directly might allow me to find some way of solving the issue. But you know I cannot do that now. The presence of a captain in the mortal world would be immediately detected, and you know how much Captain Tuan despise me and my work. He would complain it loudly enough that the spy would surely learn of it and warn Shinji. He knows he cannot stand against me any more he could have against Yoroichi. He will flee if he thinks I might be showing up. Please, Rukia, just be patient, and Mr. Kurosaki, do take care that your sword does not break, and I am sure that I will be able to help more eventually. You really shouldn't be discussing this much information, you know? If somebody were to learn of it, they could use it against us in many ways." Aizen offered a friendly smile to Yoriyuki and said, in a self-assured tone, "Don't worry, my friend, nobody would be able to tap into my private channel, not even the best minds the 12th Division has to offer. I handled all the cryptography personally. This line if fully secure." That caused the cat to shake her head and comment, "We didn't think there could be a spy in your division in the first place until they helped Hirako escape and Jin avoid justice. You're too confident in yourself, my friend, and it's gonna be your downfall someday." Aizen chuckled at that, then waved the group goodbye, and disconnected. Ichigo let out a long breath, then turned to Rukia and said, "I wanted to ask you something, as well." "Oh. See, Orium and Chad have full bringer powers now, but Tatsuki doesn't, but she'll want to be involved in our fighting anyway, and thus need training. Except she doesn't have a Zanpakuto, so I was wondering what would be better for her to learn. Chad and Orium aren't really skilled enough at the whole full bringer thing to be able to help her train either, and I don't even know if she has any skill at the Quincy thing, much less if Ishida would be willing to train her." Being called upon, Ishida shook his head as he answered, "I can already tell you, she's not inclined to using the Quincy arts at all. I can tell when somebody has the proper leaning at a glance. It's why I thought you might be one of us. And even if she had the ability, which she doesn't, I wouldn't be able to train her myself. I would need to ask my master." Ichigo nodded, then turned back to Rukia, who said, "I see the problem. I suppose teaching her Ho-Ho would be necessary, but you're right that it on its own isn't really enough for fighting. I suppose I could try Hakuta, but I'm really not so good at it I'd be confident teaching another. All the more reason you should train in it as well, don't you think? I did always found you neglected that part of your training far too much. We really should remedy that." Rukia started to sweat at the words of Yoriyuki, who was now sitting on the girl's shoulder. When she had got there, Ichigo wouldn't be able to say, and said, in what sounded like a pained tone, "Ah, mistress, there's really no need for you to bother with it. I'm sure I can do it on my own after all." "Nonsense. Why should you, when you can have a real Hakuta Grandmaster tutoring you in the finest of the Shinigami arts in the greatest of detail? It'll be a bracing experience, it's a promise." For some reason, looking on Rukia's face, Ichigo suspected that he wasn't going to enjoy whatever training Yoriyuki had in store for them, but then he gathered his resolve and nodded. Even if it was hard, if it helped Tatsuki become able to protect herself, it would be worth it. "I am then at your disposal for the training, sensei." Yoriyuki grinned, which in a cat's body was somewhat threatening, then she purred as she said, "Oh, I like this one, we're gonna have so much fun together." That sent another shiver down Ichigo's spine. He really hoped this would be worth it. Sitting on the bench, Jinjo tried to understand how it had all gone wrong. His Heinz boy wasn't all that strong, in fact he'd had him on the ropes, but then the others had joined him and he'd let himself be distracted like a beginner, and as a result Ririka and Yukio had both gotten caught, and he'd also lost the cross of scaffold. Kiriko was looking after Jackie now, but he knew that, when the woman was back on his feet, he would insist on them going to speak with Shinji Hiriko, the traitorous Shinigami who had chosen to help them, but Hiriko was only helping them because he hoped to use Yukio's power to get back to Soul Society. Once he knew that Yukio was captured, probably dead, why would they keep him alive? Really, the Shinigami would leave them to die, that was if he didn't just decide to murder them himself to cover his tracks. They couldn't go to him. But what could they do then? He would love nothing better than to track down his Heinz boy and steal their items back from him, but on his own, he didn't really stand a chance, and while he was good enough of a Fullbringer to awaken a new item for himself, the only one in Skyushin capable of doing it, really, it would never be as useful or powerful as his cross was, which meant Kiriko would think it too risky to help him. He needed a way to get Kiriko, and thus also Jackie, on board if he was to succeed. He was still trying to figure out his next action when a sound of steps suddenly echoed within the room, and then a voice that he would never forget said, in a mocking tone, "Why, if it isn't a complete failure of a Fullbringer? You really think you'll ever get your revenge on me, if brooding like this is all that you're left with after a bunch of kids gave you a bloody nose?" Jinjo was moving before he had even registered it, fishing out his pocket knife and wrapping it in his Ryutsu as he struck at the Shinigami in front of him, a tall young man with long, wavy black hairs and a small scar to the left of his dark, judging eyes. Jinjo's knife went straight through the Shinigami's throat, but no blood came from the cut. Then the man tilted his head to the side, in the process widening the wound some more, and when he took a step back, Jinjo could see that the flesh underneath was a white paste with no features, instead of sporting anything like muscles, bones or blood. The man in front of him grinned, and then his look changed, his body turning in that of a woman with very familiar brown eyes, the wavy hairs also changing color to brown as the wound knitted itself together on its own, and Jinjo took a step back from the figure of Masaki Kurosaki, the Quincy he hated the most, but she should be dead, shouldn't she? She'd been killed, by. Laughter, rich and deep and threatening, came from behind him, and Jinjo turned, as a massive figure emerged from the shadow, moving on 4 legs that each sported a red hand rather than any feet, its whole hunched form covered in dark green fur, with a mask as huge as a whole human body that sported a set of 4 holes under each of the 2 deep sockets that showed glowing red eyes within, and an unsettlingly human grin straight underneath. "You know, you'd looked so much tougher the last time we met. Have you gone soft, Fullbringer?" Jinjo was dead, he knew this. Grand Fisher was the strongest hollow he'd ever fought, and he was a master of deception alongside with it. He couldn't even be sure he was really facing the real body right now, and he had no real weapon to fight with. If the hollow wanted him dead, he could do nothing to stop him. But he wouldn't go down without a fight, and certainly not cowering, so he put on his best challenging grin and answered instead. "Why are you here, hollow? Looking for a fight?" The hollow chuckled, and answered. "If I was, you certainly wouldn't be able to give me one, weak as you are, especially without your weapon. No, I am here on behalf of a group that has a vested interest in bringing down the Shinigami, and one of our agents just intercepted a very interesting conversation, which suggested contacting you would offer a possibility that'd be mutually beneficial to us both." "Really now? Hollow's cooperating with Shinigami? And I'm supposed to believe it?" "Believe what you will. The people we're working with have a vested interest in destroying Soul Society. They see it as a corrupt system that brought great harm to their loved ones. They want the same thing you do, which is why we want to offer you this chance at revenge. Do you want it?" Jinjo looked at the hollow for a long time, remembering how many of his old friends had died at its very hand, and let out a bark of dark laughter before finally answering. "You win, monster. I'm in." Chapter 13, Tatsuki. It had taken 3 days for Tatsuki to recover completely, even with her healing accelerated thanks to Rukia briefly removing her soul, alongside another of her Henkin key trinkets so that now Tatsuki, too, could move around incorporeally. Which was how they'd ended up in their usual spot in the park, except that Rukia was standing next to them with a defeated expression, while teaching them on the other side was Yoroichi, still in her form of a black cat which, she'd assured them, would be no impediment at all to proper training. She looked quite satisfied with herself, in that way cats could often look, as she said. Very well, I hope you are all ready to give it your all. Proper training into Hakuta is very demanding, which is why, of the 4 Shinigami art, it is the one mastered last and, generally, only by those who want to progress in their career, since mastery of it is required for a promotion to captain and at least an advanced level of proficiency is required to be accepted as lieutenants. I do hope that those of us who are uninterested in that won't slack off just because of that, yes. Rukia let out an annoyed huff at that and said, I'm not bad at Hakuta because I don't want a promotion, I'm bad at it because it's difficult, and I don't really need it anyway. Don't you? Seeing as Hakuta is the best way Shinigami have to actually go on the offensive when they can't use their Zanpakuto for whatever reason, I would have expected a Shinigami who has lost her sword to need it more than ever. I can get by with Kido perfectly fine, really. I'm only doing this to help the others. Right, of course. The tone Yoriyuki had used, Ichigo doubted she was in agreement with Rukia, and he could see Rukia didn't think so either and seemed ready to continue the discussion further, so he interrupted to ask, in the hope it would actually start the lesson. So, it's a more direct style than Ho-Ho, right? How does it work exactly? Yoriyuki offered a smile, or as much of one as a cat could manage, and answered. Oh, at its core, it's actually quite simple, and in fact, there's plenty of affinities with Ho-Ho, since they're both about emotional control. The primary difference is that, where Ho-Ho is focused on controlling the emotions that keep your soul together to affect your soul's own Reishi, Hakuta is about using them to shape and direct the Ryotsu flowing out of your body instead, giving it shape and form so it can be weapon and armor both. To demonstrate, she surrounded her body with an armor of Ryotsu, which had Ichigo's frowning at the sight, as he commented. That looks the same as what Fullbringers do. Yoriyuki turned to look at him with a raised eyebrow, how did she manage that, and said, sounding bemused. I don't think so, there's nothing alike between Hakuta and Fullbring, I've fought enough users of both to know. They look the same to me. And that's why you're the student and I'm the teacher. If you could put up a Fullbringer defense, I'd show you how they're different, but I can, actually. That caught Yoriyuki by surprise, and she motioned with her tail for him to do so as she said. Well, show me then, a demonstration will make the difference clearer than an explanations would. Ichigo nodded, and once again replicated the trick he'd learned from Chad, wrapping himself into an armor of Ryotsu. Yoriyuki moved closer, nodding to herself as she commented. As I thought. Then she turned to Ichigo's left. Tatsuki, right. Ichigo's friend seemed to suddenly wake up out of her stupor when Yoriyuki addressed her directly. Until then, she'd been too shocked by the whole experience of being taught an entirely new martial art to fight ghosts by a talking cat, which had kept her uncharacteristically silent. Still, when Yoroichi addressed her directly, she shook herself, and her eyes assumed the most focused expression he knew was her default when learning and practicing anything related to physical fitness. Yes, sensei. Press down on Ichigo's arm, tell me what it feels like, Ichigo, please hold up your arm and then keep it as still as possible. He nodded, offering his arm to Tatsuki, and his friend grabbed it, trying to push it down, however, she completely failed, and he could feel how the force of her push was dampened enough by the layer of Ryotsu to be completely dispersed. Tatsuki frowned and put more effort into it, but even with all her strength she couldn't, considering Ichigo knew the armor was enough to withstand explosions. He wasn't surprised. It's immovable. Yoriyuki nodded, then asked. How would you say it felt? Was it the same as it would be if you were in your bodies, or different? It felt like my effort was dampened somewhat? Like my fingers had grip on the arm, but when I pressed down, they pushed only on the skin rather than the arm itself. Like it would if his arm was standing on a table, maybe. Good. Now try it with this. She offered her tail, and Tatsuki looked at it for a moment, then nodded and grabbed it, but was once again unsuccessful in moving it in any way. However, she frowned after she let go, and Yoroichi asked. It was different, wasn't it? Yes, sensei. It was as if I was trying to push down a steel bar. It was clearly the tail that was too rigid and fixed to be moved, not something that was supporting it. A subtle difference, but I know that in combat every little detail can be crucial. Just so. Then she turned her attention to Ichigo and went on. See, what you were doing was to collect the Ryotsu around yourself and attach it to your skin, basically imbuing it with your power. That's how all Fullbringer powers work. They push Ryotsu into their items to awaken their powers, or into their surroundings to bend them to their will. That's really it? I've seen them use technique like air walking. I expect they were simply applying their Ryotsu to the air surrounding them. Ichigo nodded. He should explain this to Chad when he next saw him, it might help with his training. Unaware of Ichigo's train of thought, Yoroichi went on. Hakuda doesn't work like that at all, however, it is focused on manipulating the Ryotsu itself, not using it to affect another medium. That's what makes it the best of all spiritual martial arts. Rukia let out a long breath at that and commented. Really? Isn't your family's traditional martial art supposed to be ho-ho? In fact, being the best Shunpo user ever is what you're famous for, isn't it? I never really liked those labels that much, you know? Very superficial. As you say, lightning goddess. That caused Yoriuki to smile as she commented. I always thought that nickname was more of a reference to my equal ability in both, so you're free to keep using it to address me, I won't get offended. Rukia shook her head, although Ichigo could see the smile forming on her lips, while Yoriuki went on, more serious. Anyway, to truly master Hakuda you need to understand how Reishi works. Ichigo, what do you know of it? That it's more durable due to being made of feeling, emotions, and memories. And stronger emotions also make your strikes more powerful, if I understood correctly. Yoriuki nodded, then turned to Tatsuki and asked. So, how do you think that could be used, Tatsuki? Any ideas? Ichigo's friend took a moment to think it over, clearly doing her best to quickly get to grasp with the new concept she was being presented with, before finally answering, with her usual confidence. If I understood correctly, I would guess that somehow managing to feel, or at least focus on, certain emotion or memories on command, would cause specific effects? In other martial arts I know, that's the way it normally works, understand the composing elements, then use them at the right time, with the proper timing. Yoriuki smiled at that and commented. Very good. That's mostly it for the emotional portion. Then there is the shaping. Ryotsu is mostly like a gas constantly leaking from your soul, but since it is still a part of you, it can be shaped. She raised her tail, and surrounded herself with Ryotsu, clearly shaping it like a coat to cover her whole body, and then went on. Now, using Ryotsu as an armor is the basics of Hakuda, but once you get good at it, it can actually be reshaped into any form that might be useful. Like a shield, or a sword, or an additional limb. Every time, she demonstrated, extending the coat over her tail to twice the length, then changing the portion that was jutting out to match her words. She had the hand of Ryotsu she'd shaped at the end of her tail flex its fingers, just to prove that it could, before returning to the normal form of the coating as she went on. The applying of emotions is different, and harder, but even more useful. Essentially, every emotion has an effect upon your soul. You must learn to call on the emotions, or at least the memories that would awaken those emotions within you, on command, and then impress them onto the Ryotsu. It's really not that complicated, everybody already knows instinctively how emotions work. Rage will inflame your spirit, fear will make you freeze, determination hardens you like rock, disdain is cold and hard like steel, and excitement is electrifying. Once again, she demonstrated as she spoke, with the Ryotsu around her form seeming to burn, then crystallize, then suddenly become still, then taking a glinting sheen, and then it seemed to turn into a storm of electricity surrounding her entire form, the currents running all over her fur even as she offered a grin which, in her cat's body, resulted quite fearsome. Then she went on to say, keeping the smile on. Don't worry, it might seem difficult, but once I'm done with you, it will feel second nature. Ichigo couldn't help the sense of dread that proclamation gave him. Perhaps this whole training thing hadn't been that good of an idea after all. Tatsuki grinned as she went through the motions of the weird new kata once more, and thought confidently to herself that this training was one of the best ideas Ichigo had ever had. Sure, having to be trained by a weird talking cat who was apparently some sort of military leader for the armies of Soul Reapers wasn't something she would have ever expected to happen to her, but she didn't really care too much. It was clear her new teacher knew what she was talking about, and besides, with how involved Ichigo had become with this weird thing, she wasn't going to let herself be left behind. Plus, learning a new martial art was always cool. Said coolness was somewhat tarnished by the fact that her sensei insisted in pitting Tatsuki against Rukia in sparring, which was clearly several levels of skill above her, and just as clearly completely bored by the training, even as she applied herself the required amount. The girl already got a bit on her nerves from how she'd tried to intimidate her into not helping Ichigo, but the fact that she didn't enjoy perfecting her combat skills at all was, in Tatsuki's eyes, even more grating. The fact she was obviously holding back a lot to not wipe the floor with her didn't help matter either. So, Tatsuki, do you think you have the kata down? Let me take one more run through it, sensei, then I'll be ready. The cat nodded to her, and Tatsuki once more closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and focused on her emotions. She surrounded herself into an armor of her own energy while remembering all the reasons while she was doing this, the determination hardening it around her like hard stone. Then she moved forward, keeping the determination pushing her forward, giving more impetus to her every step and increasing the power of her fists. Then she focused on peace and tranquility, focusing hard as she could to held both the emotions so that she could keep the external portions of her armor hardened even as she turned the rest fluid like water, so that she could flexibly move the armor itself around to deflect incoming attacks, and then she finished with a single punch that focused all of her anger, which was always among the easiest things to do, as well as making it extend as far past her punch as she could, which was way harder, which was meant to result in the equivalent of firing a puff of fire from her punch, in spiritual terms. She nodded to herself for having successfully completed the kata once more, then turned toward the waiting Rukia, and when Yoriuki nodded, she moved, starting with the armor to stop Rukia's non-charged attack, then delivering her set of attacks that her opponent pushed aside in turn by applying her own sliding defense, before Rukia shifted to offense herself, and Tatsuki could feel her rage raising as she saw how the other girl had clearly let a beat pass before doing so, to give Tatsuki time to prepare for it. She didn't need to be babied like this. Then she was forced to focus on the defensive as Rukia delivered her own set of attacks, but despite them being as hard as Tatsuki's own had been, she could just see it in her eyes, how controlled and neutral Rukia was, how she clearly wasn't putting even close to her full determination into it. Tatsuki wasn't stupid and had structured sparring with superior opponents before, but she was usually good enough to draw out some effort from her opponents, to make them push themselves just a bit past what was needed, which in turn helped her push herself to get better in turn. But with Rukia, there was none of that, and it was grating. They moved to the end of the kata, with Rukia taking the step backwards that was supposed to be her opening for the final attack, and Tatsuki couldn't help herself as she let out all of the rage she'd been accumulating out at once, far more and more powerful than the kata was supposed to be. She could see the spiritual flames quite literally exploding forward, and Rukia just made a single circular motion with her hand, creating a shield of freezing disdain that stopped her attack dead, which was the proper ending to the kata and, most importantly and annoyingly, she had delivered without any hint of extra effort at all, as if the fact that Tatsuki had struck with over 5 times the power she should have was no inconvenience to her, no reason to push herself in any way. Rukia looked neutral for a moment, then thoughtful, but before she could say anything, Yoriuki was there and said to Tatsuki, in a lecturing tone, "You're doing well, but you need to become faster with your emotional control. You let the emotions build too much before applying them, which makes you easy to read and counter. I think we need to find some way to have you practice under greater pressure, that might help, but I'm not sure you're ready for free-form sparring yet." Perhaps dash. Yoriuki interrupted herself suddenly, her head snapping to the side. A moment later, Rukia's did as well, and the Shinigami commented, perplexed. "That's quite a lot of hollows to have appeared all at once. Should we investigate it?" Yoriuki smiled in that threatening way of hers and said, "Of course. We need to dispose of them, after all, and it'll be an excellent way for Tatsuki to test her progress, and maybe the danger of live battle will help her work out how to quickly swap between emotional states. Come on, get going." Tatsuki turned to the Catwoman with a certain surprise. "You're not coming, sensei?" "No, I shall be watching from here. I need to keep myself hidden. I can't be getting into battle like that. Besides, small fries like these would just be down in less than a second and let me frustrated, and that'd be annoying." She then patted her on the shoulder with her paw, and added, "Don't worry, if you seem to be in too much trouble, I can just get there in an heartbeat." Half an heartbeat? Might be I could be able to get there, solve everything and then get back here in half an heartbeat. That'd be a fun challenge to try, especially since I need to remain undercover. Could I manage it? Maybe. Rukia interrupted Yoriyuki's increasingly less intelligible mumbles as she said, in a serious tone. "I think that maybe Tatsuki shouldn't come. Last time I let her come along she almost got killed, and while these hollows seems weak, there's enough of them to make it dangerous." Before Rukia could say anything more, Tatsuki had moved forward, without even realizing it, and grabbed the front of Rukia's clothes as she very nearly growled at her. "Again with this? I thought we had this discussion already. Whatever the rest of you are doing, I'm gonna do it too, and you're not gonna scare me away. You might be the one in charge of this whole mission, but whether or not I want to risk my life is my own decision to make, not yours." Tatsuki paused there, feeling almost shocked with herself at the emphasis she'd just berated Rukia with. The Shinigami, on the other hand, looked completely dumbfounded for a moment, before eventually she grinned, even if there was still surprise on her face as she said, "I suppose it is, at that. All right then, try to keep up, we've no time to waste." And with that, she darted forward, running on air at ludicrous speed. Tatsuki frowned, realizing she couldn't really follow that, but before she could figure out some way around it, Ichigo was next to her, offering to carry her, which she allowed. As they rushed forward, Ichigo told to her, sounding serious, "I know you want to fight, but hollows can be very dangerous. The first I ever met was strong enough he almost killed me and Rukia both." Tatsuki felt annoyed at that, even though he wasn't sounding patronizing, and asked, "And were all others equally dangerous?" Ichigo shook his head, answering, "No, that one was the scariest I've met yet, but that doesn't mean another one like it can't come along at any time." He seemed to sense that she was about to tell him to stop worrying so much, for his next sentence was spoken with a certain urgency. "Look, I'm not telling you not to fight, but if you think the enemies are too strong, go on the defensive and wait for one of us to help, and whatever you do, don't underestimate them. I've seen the kind of tricks these things can pull, and they can be quite nasty." Tatsuki took that in for a moment. She supposed that it was only fair for him to be worried after her pathetic showing in their fight with the Fullbringers. She couldn't believe she'd been taken down in a single attack, and that she'd never faced an hollow before, so she nodded and answered, trying to match his own seriousness. "All right, I'll be careful." Ichigo nodded, but before either of them could say anything more, they were in the middle of a park, 12 hollows fighting and already there Rukia, the girl darting around in the air while placing barriers in their paths to stop them or shooting giant spheres of glowing fire to send the hollow smashing into the barriers, which exploded on contact. Ichigo landed, dropping her to the ground as he drew her sword, which he then pointed to a group of hollows that looked smaller than the rest and were separated from them by several layers of Rukia's barriers, and said, "Take care of those, just keep them occupied if you can't beat them, we'll be done with the rest as soon as we can." Then, trusting her to handle herself, he jumped into the air again to go helping Rukia, which caused Tatsuki to grin. It seemed her best friend did trust her to fight on her own after all. She slammed her fists together, calling on her determination and excitement as she did. She could feel her hands strong and heavy as stone as they hit each other, sparks of electricity surging from the point of contact as she launched herself forward, shouting, "All right, you monsters, let's see what you've got." The monsters immediately turned toward her, and the one in the front, a massive, ape-like creature sporting a long beaked mask like a bird and long tendrils sprouting from the top of its head, as well as its wrists and heels, grinned a terrifying smile as it said, with a deep, dark voice, "Ah, fresh meat. I was just looking forward to a nice snack." The monster barreled forward, running on all fours in an attempt to shoulder check her, but Tatsuki used her newly learned ability to give her legs the strength of stone to just jump over the creature. Then, while she was flying over the creature, she snapped downward with her hand. The creature had no fur and its skin was smooth and slick like a frog's, but this one was easy, as she called on the feeling of clinginess and affection. Orium had given her plenty of experience with both of those, which caused the gauntlet around her hand to become suddenly sticky, strongly enough to arrest her momentum. She grinned, and then slammed her other fist down with as much determination as possible, the power of the hit almost terrifying to her, and how her now stone-hard fist caused ripples to echo throughout the air as it shattered her enemy's spine. She jumped down from the monster's back, moving forward to face the other three hollows, who didn't seem at all fazed by the bigger of their numbers being defeated, with the smallest one, a sleek creature with scythes in the place of its hand in a chameleon-like mask, being the first to go on the attack, blades swinging at her with a passion. Tatsuki dodged as she advanced, focusing on forming the flowing armor of detachment and determination so that the attacks she couldn't stop were deflected away. She slid into the kata almost instinctively, mixing it up so that she transitioned between the defenses and attack portions of it, and, sure enough, as the enemy took a step back to free itself from the onslaught, she let out all of her rage into a blast of spiritual fire that sent the creature retreating with a scream, rolling itself onto the ground as it tried to put out the flames it was enveloped by. Tatsuki looked at the other two hollows who had moved to her sides, a small, dog-like one with 5 tails and a spiked crest all over its back, and a round one that didn't seem to have limbs, moving around by rolling onto itself, with a mask very flat, devoid of nose and recessed into its form. It was also covered in holes, which Tatsuki suspected it could use for attacks in some form. She focused on the spherical hollow more carefully, just keeping her eye out for the dog one, and was thus unprepared when she suddenly found herself wrapped in tentacles from behind her back. She tried to glance back, and while she was quickly forced to stop as a number of tentacles wrapped around her neck and face, she saw that the big hollow she'd thought defeated had risen again, and she realized she'd forgotten the rule to kill hollows, strike for the mask, that Ichigo had told her about. The big hollow let out a dark, threatening chuckle and said, as it inched closer, "Well, I think I'm gonna eat you very slowly, make you suffer as much as possible." Tatsuki focused the best she could to find her bravado, and once she had it, she smiled and replied, focusing as much as she could on the satisfaction of knowing herself better than her opponent. "How about no?" And then, she unleashed the feeling straight into her armor, extending it as much as she could over the tentacles themselves while she did so, and in a moment the energy turned into electricity. The monster screamed as the power surged through the tentacles and very much fried it, while Tatsuki grit her teeth. Even with knowing it in advance and having shielded herself by hardening the layer underneath, she could still feel the pain of it. It left her a bit woozy, and it had been less than a second. She resolved to herself not to try to use electrifying emotions until she had a better control. Still, she had accomplished what she wanted. As the huge hollow had fallen to the ground, she moved at it, and before it could recover enough to defend itself, she brought down what might well have been a stone booth straight on the creature's mask, shattering it. Then, she turned to the other two hollows, which had been left stunned for a moment by her show, but now recovered, and charged at them from both sides. Tatsuki took the attack head-on, aiming at the spherical hollow first and kicking it away. Then she turned with a sweeping kick, giving it just enough of a steel covering. She couldn't yet shape it to be sharp, and keeping up the right emotional focus was difficult, but it allowed her to move faster than stone would, to send the dog-like hollow falling to the ground. She went for the finishing blow, but then her attack was stopped as a long, sticky, and firm appendage wrapped itself around it, blocking it with incredible strength for something so frail-looking. She turned to her left to see that the chameleon hollow, while smoking, wasn't on fire anymore, and it was using its blades to anchor itself to the ground while keeping her still with its tongue. She went to strike at it, but before she could, the sphere hollow smashed into her back just as the chameleon let go, sending her crashing to the ground. That was when the chameleon shouted, angry, "Keep up the pressure, don't let her get her breath. We tire her out first, and eat her only once she's too weak to fight it off. Don't try to take a bite or go for the kill, just keep attacking." Tatsuki got to her feet as fast as she could, but before she could find proper footing, the dog-like hollow slammed into her legs, sending her to the ground away. She kicked it away, but then the spherical one, which, she now saw, could somehow propel itself around by shooting air out of its many holes, smashed in her side again. She went on the defensive, just as Ichigo had suggested, keeping up the mixed flowing and hardened defense, and tried to look for a moment to strike as the hollows kept the pressure up by attacking one after the other with the specific goal of leaving her no respite. And they kept succeeding. Tatsuki couldn't manage to find her footing, only barely managing to counter-attack, and even then without gaining any chance to collect herself from it. The chameleon had joined the charge, attacking her in melee whenever the other two had to retreat. As it thrust a blade at her, she managed to grab it by moving the armor to cover only the palms of her hands, and threw the enemy away, but even as she turned back to the other two she could feel them almost falling onto her, and that was when they slammed into a glowing, triangular wall of golden light. Tatsuki looked at the sudden defense with a mix of shock and confusion, unsure where it had appeared from even as the two hollow fell to the ground from it, and then a familiar voice shook her up. "Tatsuki! I'm so glad you're fine." She turned, to see that, matching the voice she'd heard, her savior was actually Orium. The orange-haired girl was standing on another triangular wall, except this one was horizontal rather than vertical, but she jumped down from it as soon as she was next to her and started to say, worried, "We need to rush back. This whole thing was a distraction, to keep us all away while Jackie's group stole the items. We need to hurry." Then, before Tatsuki could answer, Orium turned toward the chameleon hollow who was charging at them, and the platform dissolved itself, its three corners turning into glowing globes of lights that immediately smashed into the hollow in quick succession, their circular motion around them so fast that the impact was powerful enough to send the hollow flying in the direction of Orium's other platform. Her friend turned, following the monster's flight with her eyes, and before it could impact the wall, she snapped her fingers and the wall disappeared. The hollow smashed straight into the other two, sending them all toppling to the ground together, and then Orium gestured again, the 6 globes of light forming into 3 different lines of light that flew forward at high speed, each angled differently. They went through the hollows like hot knives through butter, cutting the 3 of them into several pieces, and the lines went through them again on their way back, making sure that no masks had been spared. The whole thing had taken less than 5 seconds, and then Orium had reformed the platform she'd been flying upon earlier, and dragged Tatsuki on top of it as she said, "Come on, we need to warn Ichigo and Rukia, we need to regroup at the shop." And with that, she directed them forward. Rukia let herself be carried by the flying platform, but within, she was in turmoil. If she'd struggled so much against enemies that even Orium had dispatched like it was nothing, then, had Rukia been right? Was she really too weak to fight alongside her friends, so incapable of protecting them that Orium had had to protect her instead? Was she going to become useless, left behind by her friends? Chapter 14, Fullbring. As he followed after Orium, Ichigo asked, trying to get his bearings. "So, what's going on? Can you tell us?" Orium nodded with a determined expression and answered. "It seems that the bad guys allied with big squads of hollows. They sent one to keep Ishida occupied, while they had another few helping in the attack to the shop, and these we just beat." Rukia grinned at that and said, "That's good. It means that we're in the best case scenario." "What do you mean?" "It has to have been Hiriko who gave them these group of hollows, and if he did that, it means he learned of their failure but didn't cut and run, and also means that once they get their stuff back, they'll lead us straight to Hiriko's base, so we can finally capture him." Ichigo nodded, then focused on what he saw as the big problem right now. "That's fine, but we can't just let these hollows they called upon run free." Rukia sobered at that, going into her more analytic mode. "Right. We're most definitely looking at a chase, and they'll likely split into groups to divide our focus and allow the team with Yukio's item to make it back to Hiriko. I think I'll need to be in whichever group is at the head of the pursuit. Ishida is the only one faster than I am, but if he's not there, it's probably better for me to take the lead alone, rather than risk losing them. I'd probably ask the rest of you to split as necessary and then try to catch up if you can manage it, but I think it's best to keep it fluid for now, since everybody has different specialties. If it's a single strong hollow, you'd be the better choice, but if it was a large number of very weak stragglers, Orium would probably be the one capable to dispose of them the fastest." Orium pumped her fist in satisfaction at that as she commented, "I'll show you how awesome I am, Rukia. None of those ghosts shall escape the wrath of my hairpins." That caused Ichigo and Rukia both to chuckle a bit, which in turn made Ichigo notice that Tatsuki seemed out of it. She was deep in thought and didn't seem to be listening to the conversation at all. Curious as to the why of it, as well as a bit worried that she might have gotten hurt in her fight, he asked, "Tatsuki? Is everything fine?" Being addressed directly seemed to snap his friend out of her fugue, as she refocused her gaze on him and was quick to nod in answer. "Yeah, nothing worth worrying about. I was just reviewing the fight in my head, thinking of ways to improve." Ichigo chuckled at that, from the way Yoryuki kept picking up a never-ending laundry list of mistakes in every form she'd taught him, while only having the occasional minor correction for Tatsuki, he was pretty sure that his friend had very little to worry about. Still, he knew she was very driven to be the best, especially when it came to fighting, so he said to her, trying to be reassuring. "If you want, we could stick together for this next fight then, maybe being able to compare how we go about it will help, and we're a terrific team when we're together." She seemed surprised at his first words, but the final comment caused her to chuckle and answered. "Oh yeah, that we are. I bet the guys we faced in that team tournament 3 years ago still have nightmares from the experience." They both laughed at that, and he was glad to see that Tatsuki seemed more relaxed after that, at least until they got inside of Urahara's shop and Rukia said, "Back to being all business." "All right, we're here, get ready." Ichigo nodded, releasing Sode no Shirayuki in preparation. As they reached their destination, they could see that Chad seemed to be fighting with a large amount of hollows. None of them looked particularly powerful, and in fact Ichigo's friend seemed capable of pulverizing several at once with a single blast, but there were at least 24 in total, and they were very spread out. Rukia looked at the battlefield critically for a moment, then said, "I'll try to corral them out in a single place, that was the rest of you can take them out more easily." Ichigo nodded, then an idea formed in his mind as he watched Chad fire another one of his energy beams and said to Rukia, "Actually, once you have them grouped together, I think I can take them all out in a single attack." "Good." Rukia didn't wait or ask for explanation, instead moving both of her hands in front of her to create the gigantic variant of her golden fire sphere that Ichigo had only seen her use during their first meeting, and sent it barreling toward the enemies, the attack smashing into the entire group. It didn't have enough power to finish them, but it did carried them along with itself, concentrating their entire group all in one place. Ichigo then darted forward, even as he shouted, "Chad, fire another beam in front of you, right now." His friend did so immediately, trusting Ichigo to know what he was doing, and he sliced with Sode no Shirayuki straight through the beam, spreading its power through it all. He had the sword spirit herself ensuring the power was applied just right, so that, the very moment the Zanpakuto had cut through it all, Ichigo found himself in front of a straight-up massive pillar of ice. Then he struck forward with his other hand, pushing out all of his hatred and disgust for hollows in the precise way Yoryuki had taught him to, which resulted, obviously, according to her, in giving his Ryutsu a powerful repulsive force. Which right now resulted into the huge ice pillar being sent flying straight into the enemy hollows, smashing them into the wall and turning most of them into paste, which was subsequently annihilated when what few of the energy on the inside of the beam hadn't been frozen yet exploded outwards as the ice broke on impact and released it. Chad raised a thumb up to Ichigo in recognition of the success of his attack, but before they could talk Rukia was there and asked, "Serious?" "Right, so that was the hollows, but where are the Fullbringers?" "They went that way." Rukia moved to watch in the direction Chad was pointing and nodded to herself as she said, "That's the direction we know their hideout to be at, which means we can catch up if we move fast enough. I was hoping my trick would have hold them here for longer." "What trick?" Rukia offered him a very smug smile as she slowly pulled out something from her pocket. "You see, while we had to let them find the video game console or they'd never lead us to Hirako, we didn't have to let them recover all of their stuff. I was hoping they would waste time looking for the rest. Shame they didn't, but at least we won't be fighting them at full power, you know." She showed the cross pendant and the white toy gun decorated with a lot of hearts to Ichigo in the most self-satisfied way imaginable, then put them back into her own pocket as she said, "All right then, let's get going, we can't let them get away, they've a lot of head start already." Ichigo nodded, and once more they were off, running on air as fast as their feet could lead them, with Rukia slowly gaining more and more of a lead while, behind Ichigo, Orium's platform that was carrying everybody else was lagging behind somewhat, and the girl herself seemed to look just a bit tired by the effort of keeping it manifested. Ichigo frowned at that, then realized he might help. He'd wanted to talk with Chad and Orium about Yoryuki's explanation on Fullbringer, but hadn't had the time. Now that he could, however, he slowed down to match Orium's flying pace and explained. "Chad, Orium, when I was speaking with our new teacher, she said something about Fullbringer abilities that I think might help, that Fullbringers push their feelings into their surroundings to get their power, and that perhaps the technique to walk on air might work by imbuing the air itself with it. Do you think that's worth trying, so that we could move faster? Chad seemed to be considering the idea, but that was when Tatsuki spoke up, sounding disappointed. Even if they could master the trick right now, Ichigo, I wouldn't be able to, so Orium would still need to keep the same pace to carry me along. And if that's the case, it's better for everybody to not risk trying new techniques right now, so we can all be in top form for the battle. Tatsuki had a point, Ichigo had to concede, although I could carry you. She shook her head at his offer and shot back. And then it'd be you who'd be tiring himself. Didn't you tell me that you almost lost the last time you fought this Jinjo guy? Yeah, but he's unarmed now, that's gotta make him weaker than before, so dash. Enemy ahead. Everybody turned to Rukia, who was slowing down as three Fullbringers were standing over a roof. Ichigo recognized them as Jackie, Kiriko, and Ririka, although it was weird for the latter to be there when she didn't have her item with her. It was the older one who shouted at the group, in a confident tone. Give up, Shinigami. We'll stop you here, and even if you win, Jinjo will come back with allies powerful enough to crush you all. You've no idea what you're up against. I suggest you to just stop with this futile battle right now, and save everyone a lot of pain. Rukia didn't even slow down, instead she shouted. Orium, Sato, you take on the three of them. Ichigo, Tatsuki, you keep following me if you can. Then, before anybody could intercept her, she shot another of her huge golden spheres. The enemies easily dodged out of the way of it, but they hadn't realized that, just as she fired, she'd also grabbed on the projectile, using it to push herself forward while ensuring none of the enemy was in her way. She let go of it immediately afterwards before waving to the enemies in a very smug manner, and then continuing her chase immediately afterwards. Jackie went to jump after her, but she slammed straight into an invisible wall that Rukia had left behind, her mocking wave having actually been meant. Ichigo realized, to conceal her own casting. He chuckled at how Rukia had turned the fact that her Kido could be cast with nothing more than a single hand's gestures to her advantage. A trick like that wouldn't have worked with the kind of spells found in stories, that required wands and magic words and other such things. With the Fullbringers stumped, Ichigo turned to Tatsuki and said to her, offering the most apologetic grin he could. I'm sorry, it seems I'll need to carry you after all. She let out an annoyed huff as she answered. Fine, but you're going to be teaching me this air walking trick next chance we have, got it? He nodded, and then Tatsuki turned to Orium, suddenly hugging her as she said. And you stay safe, okay? The taller girl looked to be almost crying, but she recovered quickly as she nodded while pumping her fist and adding. You bet I will, they won't even know what hit them. And with that, Ichigo darted forward, leaving his friends behind to face the three Fullbringers, trusting that they'd manage on their own while he and Tatsuki headed forward to help Rukia in her continuing chase. With Tatsuki, Ichigo, and Rukia gone, Orium refocused her attention on the three enemies in front of them, before puffing her cheeks in annoyance and placing a hand on her hips, the other pointing straight at the older of the two women among them. Jackie! Why are you and your friend being so mean? You lied to us and are trying to start a war. That's bad. The older woman looked at least a bit chagrined at that, which soothed Orium's ruffled feelings somewhat. If nothing else, she knew she was being mean and shouldn't have lied to them, and she eventually said, I'm sorry girlie, but that's just the way things are. To get his revenge is Jinjo's goal, and he did a lot to help every one of us. We owe it to him to help him achieve his goal. But other people will get hurt. Don't you care about that? That caused Jackie's expression to darken as she answered. Nobody cared when I got hurt, why should I care about them in turn? They're all already dead anyway, it doesn't matter at all. Orium stomped her foot on the platform they were standing on, and was about to answer to that. Really, Jackie had to see how repaying pain with pain would never lead anywhere nice, but before she could, the redhead, whose name Orium couldn't remember, shouted. Enough of this silliness, we need to take them down if we want to go help Jinjo. Move, both of you. Jackie and her one-eyed friend nodded and charged. With Jackie on front, Orium prepared herself to call the other half of Shunrika that wasn't currently keeping her afloat to stop the attack, but before she could, Sato got in the way, his arm covered in his shield glove with which he stopped Jackie's falling kick. The impact caused a shockwave that forced Orium to take a couple steps back, but Sato didn't budge an inch, instead eyeing the other woman as he told her, in his usual serious tone. You aren't the only one to fight for her friends, I will protect mine with all of my strength. Then he pushed her away, before heading forward, blasting at Jackie with a beam of energy that she deflected away with a kick. Then Orium refocused on the other enemy, who was coming for her, and with a gesture, it felt a bit silly, but Tsubaki had insisted that proper ninja used hand signals to communicate without the enemy knowing, and the idea of being a ninja was way too cool to pass off. A new barrier formed in front of her, causing the butler's spinning pocket watch to bounce off of it without arm. She knew it was a powerful attack. On the bounce back it pulverized the rooftop fence it slammed into, but Orium was confident that her shield was indestructible. She deactivated the one she was standing on with a snap of her fingers, landing on the rooftop in a crouch as the three fairies that had been forming it started to orbit around her in lazy circles, while she frowned and said to the man, "You know you're gonna lose just like last time, right? Your clock can't beat my shield. Couldn't you just surrender? That way, there'd be no need for anybody to get hurt." The mustachioed man shook his head sadly at that, and replied, "I'm afraid things will go differently this time, miss. You are right that you can beat me, of course, but that's precisely why I'm not your real opponent, just the distraction." Orium frowned a moment at that, but then Shino, who was leading the group defending her, shouted suddenly, "Orium, jump. Now." She did, fast as she could, and a moment later the redhead smashed the ground with a punch, her long red pigtails trailing after her even as she held her hat in place with the other hand. Orium watched with surprise as her new opponent raised her fist, cracking her neck to the side as she glared at Orium with disgust clear on her features and said, "It seems your awakened item is even better than I expected. Typical, really, some people have all the luck." Orium's eyes narrowed at that, while Shino preened, in a very smug tone, "Of course we are. Who do you think you're dealing with, lady? We're the best. The name's Ryrika, if you don't mind using it, little pixie, but I wasn't talking to you, rather your master." Orium raised a hand to stop the spirit of her item from starting a spat, while Ryrika went on, sounding annoyed. "Let me ask you one thing, Orium Inu. Why were you trying to solve this with words, when you have a power so much stronger than any of the rest of us here does?" That had Orium's determination fade a bit, as she looked at the other girl in confusion. How could she not understand? It wasn't a difficult concept. "Because I don't want anyone to get hurt." Ryrika's glare strengthened as she raised both fists and said, in a dark tone, "That's too bad then, because somebody will be getting hurt for sure." Then she charged at her, moving far faster than Orium thought anybody could. Orium sent her fairies onward, but when the first was about to smash into her, Ryrika suddenly stopped, letting it pass in front of her before snatching her hand forward, grabbing the fairy, Lily. Orium was sure, so that she was dragged forward by it. Lily realized what had happened and slowed suddenly, to allow Began behind her to catch up and smack into Ryrika, but just as that was about to happen, Ryrika let go, causing the two fairies to smash into each other, while the moment Ryrika touched the ground, it seemed to flex under her like a trampoline, allowing her to shot herself onward so fast that Orium barely had the time to raise her hands in front of her face before the fist hit her and sent her rolling backwards. As she got up, Orium could feel the pain of her cheek throbbing from the bad bruise left by Ryrika's attack despite the fact she'd interposed her arms, one of which, she also realized, felt incredibly numb. She tried to flex it and had to stifle a scream, before deciding that letting it dangle at her side was perhaps a best option. Ryrika was now glaring down her nose now. Orium's three fairies had moved back to circle around her defensively, but the redhead didn't seem fazed at all. Instead, she spoke, her tone matching her expression. "You know, people like you disgust me." "What do you mean?" "I mean, people who think they can decide who gets hurt and who doesn't, just because they think to be the strongest ones. What they call it, the law of the jungle. The strong rule, the weak do as they're bound to." "That's not what I meant at all." Ryrika scoffed. "One who is fighting for survival doesn't have the choice not to hurt those who want to kill them. Here, I'll show you." And then, Ryrika darted forward again. Orium glanced at her shield, but the other Fullbringer was still trying to move around it and striking it occasionally. He wasn't achieving anything, but Orium just couldn't recall the shield back. so she focused once more on Ryrika, and tried something different, sending Shino, Began and Lily forward all together in a direct charge, but, just as they were about to strike her, the air in front of Ryrika seemed to turn into a trampoline again, except one that pushed her backwards. Then she seemed to slam into another air trampoline behind her, but this one angled to send her flying high above Orium's fairies. They were already turning to follow Ryrika skyward, but before they'd covered even half the distance she had, Ryrika struck at the air with the hand, and a moment later it turned into another trampoline, this one aimed so that, bouncing from it, Ryrika was shot down like a missile straight at her. Orium had just enough time to roll out of the way, a moment before Ryrika slammed into the concrete, creating another small impact crater within. Orium scrambled backwards, but then Ryrika slammed her foot onto the ground, and the rooftop turned suddenly slippery, causing Orium to fall to the ground as Ryrika moved to loom over her. She couldn't understand what was going. She thought they'd taken Ryrika's magic item, hadn't they? The redhead chuckled at seeing Orium's confusion, and said, "You thought I was powerless, didn't you? Fullbring is more than just that. It is reaching out with your soul to the world around you, and asking it to bend, just a little. You can't ask too much, not of anything but an awakened item, because the world is not so smart, but with enough practice, you can get it to do little things. Like asking air to stick together when you put your weight on it rather than parting under it, maybe bending a little, even. Or asking the ground to let itself become just a little bit looser, making friction go away for a few moments. Or making your muscles and skin a bit sturdier, just enough to not tear on impact for the duration of a battle. Starting to get it now." Orium couldn't say that she fully did, but she'd gotten enough to understand. It was the same trick the other Fullbringer used to walk on air, just being used better. Perhaps Ruriko was just more skilled. Still, Orium knew that her fairies were heading back already, so she asked, both to gain time and because she just wanted to understand. "So, is this what you meant about strong and weak? That you're the stronger one because you know more tricks than I do?" Ryrika shook her head at that. "No, that's the second wrong point about the whole prey and predator thing. It's a lie the strong tell to the weak, that they could get strong too with just some effort. But that's not it either. Real strength, the one thing which always wins over everything else, comes from numbers. The real predators, the real strong ones, are those who have the majority on their side. There is no strength that is greater than that." As her speech ended, she jumped backwards, just in time to avoid Orium's returning fairies. Orium could see now that she'd made the ground into a trampoline too in order to make the jump fast enough, and as she stopped in midair, she knew she'd made another one to shot herself forward again, so Orium did the only thing she could think of, and ordered her barrier to form, causing Ryrika to slam straight into it. The Fullbringer rolled backward, apparently unbothered even if she'd gotten hurt in slamming against the shield, and instead she shouted, "Giriko, now!" Orium turned to look the older man, who raised his pocket watch and said, in a tone that sounded amused, "You probably didn't know, miss, but my item has the ability to slow down the passage of time for anything I hit with it, or restore it to its proper speed, if I disengage the effect. Like so." He pressed the button on top of the pocket watch, and suddenly, Orium was falling. She watched down, and realized that, between striking the wall, Giriko had also been striking the ground, hard enough to pulverize it just as he had the rooftop's fences before, while also applying his effect to it to keep it from collapsing, by having it stay frozen in time, until now, when it turned into a pit under Orium's feet. They'd tricked her, she realized. Giriko said he'd be the distraction, but instead, Ryrika had been. Still, she knew she could still save herself, so she quickly called for Shunrika to disengage both barriers, calling them to fly underneath her and form into a new, horizontal one to stop her fall. It stole her breath for a moment, but at least she was safe. Or at least, so she thought, until she saw Giriko bearing down on her, swinging his watch like a flail. She quickly raised her second wall, stopping him, and that was when Ryrika landed in front of her, hitting her straight in her belly with a knee strike that sent Orium to smash into her own barrier. The hit left her on her knees, head ringing and spitting blood from the sheer power of the hit. Ryrika slowly moved to loom over her once again, and this time Orium couldn't disperse either barrier. The one underneath her was the only thing separating her from a lethal fall, and the other was all that kept Giriko from striking her. Ryrika's smile was grim as she said, "And once again, Numbers wins the day. By which I don't just mean that we're 2 against 1, it's that the whole world is part of our team, since it'll do what we ask it to, which makes it so that we have the largest numbers than everybody else around. Except for the Shinigami. With their army, powers, and unity, they're too many for even us, but Jinjo has offered us a way forward, by helping him. We just need to get the Shinigami to fight each other, and once they do, we'll be stronger than even them, and we'll get to make the rules. We'll decide who get hurt and who doesn't, and then, yes, there will no longer be any need for us to get hurt. Ryrika grabbed her by the chin, forcing Orium to look her in the eyes, and then asked. I bet you get it now, don't you? Now that you're the one who's about to get hurt, to die, I bet you're ready to kill us in return, aren't you? Come on, try at least, and maybe I'll let you join our team. Orium didn't say anything for a moment, as she looked into Ryrika's eyes, so full of anger and disdain, and she found something else deep in there, hidden very well but still visible to her, loneliness. And suddenly, Orium knew what she had to do as she answered, coughing some more blood as she did. I will make it so that nobody will be hurt at all. She saw the disbelief in Ryrika's eyes, but before the other girl could process what was going on, Orium snapped the fingers of her one still functioning hand, and the platform underneath them disappeared. As she was still holding on Orium, Ryrika got dragged down for just a moment, but it was enough for Orium to gesture at her other barrier, and Tsubaki separated from it, for a moment leaving only a long cable of glowing light. Kiriko hadn't been expecting that, and between that and the loss of the ground he was standing on, he didn't have time to react as the thread of light dashed upward at blinding speed, acting like a reverse guillotine and cutting through the Fullbringer's wrist, which caused him to scream as he fell down. Ryrika let go of Orium then, moving to her ally, and a moment after she did, she slammed into a new barrier, except when she stumbled backwards, she bumped on a flat plane, and as she looked around herself, she found that she was trapped inside a pyramid of glowing light, while Kiriko's hand was slowly regenerating itself, as were the wounds Ryrika herself had took in the fight. Orium smiled, her hand grabbed firmly around Tsubaki's glowing globe of light the way Ryrika had before, keeping her from falling down, while Shino was holding Kiriko's pocket watch. Ryrika watched her with confusion on her face, and Orium grinned as she said, smiling with red teeth. See? I won, even if I didn't have the numbers, and I didn't kill anyone to do it. Ryrika continued to look at her in disbelief, even as Orium nodded to her fairies, all 6 of which very slowly raised until they were standing over the solid ground of the rooftop once again, Ryrika and Kiriko still trapped within the healing pyramid while Orium kneeling on the ground. She was still recovering her breath as Ryrika moved to the edge of the pyramid and asked, sounding annoyed. What do you think you proved with your stunt? We might be trapped now, but you're on the verge of collapse. And even if you weren't, you can't keep this cage up forever, and once you drop it, you won't be able to fight at all, while we'll be fresh and new. It's just a delaying tactic, nothing more. Orium chuckled, which caused her to cough some more blood, but then sat down and turned toward Ryrika to explain to her, after taking a long breath to ensure she would be able to speak properly. You're wrong. I don't need to keep this up forever, only until Ichigo and Tatsuki and the others come back here. Then I'll let you out, and you'll be safe and unhurt, but still have lost. That doesn't change anything, it just proves that I'm right, when your numbers will have won the game. You couldn't beat us alone. Orium shook her head. See, that's not the point. I never said that it isn't true that having help is good, of course it is. Without my friends, I never would have been here at all, I wouldn't be a magical girl who protects ghosts from monsters. But I can still decide not to hurt people as I fight. You said that it is a choice that only the stronger can make, but I don't think that. I think that it's just the harder choice to make, whether you're stronger or weaker. And yeah, maybe I'll need to choose between hurting others or getting hurt myself sometimes. But if that's what I have to do, then I'm gonna choose myself, every time. It doesn't matter if I'm weaker or stronger or alone or what, I have my beliefs, and if I stick to those, I'll win every time. Ryrika was lost, so Orium smiled, placing her still working hand over the wall as she said. Is it so strange to you, that I don't want you to get hurt, too? Ryrika's eyes widened at that, and then she started to cry. Instinctively, Orium dropped the barrier, and moved to hug the other girl, letting her keep at it for a while. Eventually, Ryrika's cry turned to short sobs, and then she said, her voice broken. You know, you're really silly and naive. If I wanted, right now, I could just squeeze you and you'd be dead. You shouldn't have let me out. Orium smiled at that, and asked. And will you? It took a long moment, but then Ryrika shook her head and muttered. Don't feel like it right now. Great. I'm so happy to hear it. Also, if you had tried to, I'd just close the pyramid again with all of us inside, that way anything you did to me would be undone, and you'd still be trapped until my friends showed up. Plus, nobody would be hurt any longer that way, not even I. Orium smiled at that, which caused Ryrika to start to chuckle, to which Orium herself joined in too, when, a few minutes later, Sato reached them with an unconscious Jackie slung over his shoulder. He was quite puzzled of finding the two girls laughing together like that. As it turned out, Rukia's speed was enough to catch up to Jinjo and Yukio soon enough. She then slowed down just a notch, enough to keep up but not to reach them, which Ichigo knew was in the hope that she could follow them to their real target's hiding place. However, it seemed clear that Jinjo wasn't going to just accept that, as eventually he and his friend headed down to a rooftop, and once they landed, Jinjo said, glaring up at them. You really think it would be so easy to take advantage of us? We knew you would try to follow us, and it's not going to work. They landed then, with Ichigo putting Tatsuki down, and Rukia said, raising an eyebrow. Are you sure that's a good idea? You're outnumbered and outgunned here, you really might need all the help you can get. She paused, then added, with a certain cockiness. Unless you have a few more hollows to drop on us? I suppose that might be enough to delay us for a handful of seconds, with the quality of the support you managed to scrounge up. Jinjo didn't seem annoyed at all at it, as instead he answered, with a grin. Maybe I have just one left, but you'll never know if I keep you here, will you? Yukio, go. As we planned. Immediately, the younger Fullbringer resumed his escape, and Rukia darted after him, except he'd barely cleared 2 rooftops before whipping his game console around. Rukia had already dodged, clearly expecting him to be trying to catch her in the trap like Orium and Chad had been, but instead the gate he opened was in another zone entirely from the one she'd been occupying, and a massive, furred green hollow was dropped down of it. Then Ichigo had to refocus his attention, as Jinjo had pulled out something from his pockets, although he relaxed as he saw it was a knife and said back. Really? Is that all you've got? Jinjo growled as he said. It'll be enough to take you down and have my revenge, don't worry, you see, unlike most Fullbringers, I can make my own replacement weapons if I really need to. And then, before Ichigo's eyes, he immediately pumped a huge amount of power in the knife, causing it to transform into another huge sword like the one he'd been wielding before. It looked remarkably similar, it even had the extended handle inside the hilt. The only real difference seemed to be that the crossguard was shaped like curved horns and there was a skull in the middle of it. Seeing that, Ichigo had to ask. I thought these awakened items were unique. They are, but they're still fueled by my personality and my connection with it, since meaningless items won't manifest a proper ability. So they tend to be similar, especially if, like I did, the Fullbringer plans for it in advance, and woke them up with a similar emotion. That said, Jinjo grinned, aiming his blade at Ichigo as he concluded. But enough pointless explanations, you won't need them, because you're gonna be dead soon. And then, with no further warning, a massive beam was fired from the sword straight at Ichigo, like a cannon. He instinctively jumped backwards even as he spun Sode no Shirayuki in front of himself, creating a sturdy ice shield, then managed to stop the beam for long enough that both Ichigo and Tatsuki managed to get themselves out of the way before the ice was finally cracked and the beam continued onward to explode in the distance behind them. The Fullbringer smiled, taking up the blade with both hands, and continued. Don't think I missed your weakness in our previous fight, you have no ability to attack at range at all. Even if I don't have access to all the powers I stole from Hollows and stored in my cross of scaffold across the years, I feel confident that getting this type of ability is just what I needed to take you out. And with that, he dashed forward, sword hefted over his shoulder. Ichigo wondered for a moment why he was doing that when he'd just said he was gonna use attacking at range to beat him, but he got his answer when Jinjo swung his blade, as a multitude of beams erupted from all points of the blade. Each ray had been fired in such a short fraction of a second that a myriad of them were unleashed in the time of that one attack, with the slash itself obviously meant to give that many attacks coverage of as big of an area as possible, and Ichigo had to move upwards and backwards with all of this speed to avoid them all, which left him even further away from Jinjo. The Fullbringer didn't stop waving his sword, continuing to send a multitude of beams in Ichigo's direction. At such distance, avoiding most of them wasn't hard, but the sheer number made it a constant effort, and getting closer was impossible, as nearer to the man the density was so high it'd be impossible to dodge anything. And then, suddenly, the barrage stopped, and Ichigo needed a moment to realize that Tatsuki had dashed toward Jinjo and was now engaging him in close quarters. The Fullbringer had to focus on dodging her attacks as she pressured him, clearly more interested in stopping him from bringing his sword to bear or blasting her away than in actually delivering the hurt. Her quick and repeated short-distance jabs and thrusts obviously meant to emphasize speed of delivery over all others' considerations. Ichigo couldn't help but grin to himself at Tatsuki's display of skill, but then he dived downwards, taking advantage of the opening she was creating for him as fast as he could while calling upon Sode no Shirayuki's power. He slammed into the roof just next to Jinjo with an impact that sent a wave of shattered concrete rippling outwards from his landing point and sent both combatants stumbling away, but Jinjo was closer, so he had no defense when Ichigo once more used the Hakuta trick of focusing fully on disgust and hatred and pushed the slabs at Jinjo like a hail of heavy projectiles, which the man had to use his large sword to deflect. Ichigo glared at his opponent. "As you can see, I learned a few new tricks since we last met. I'm not as useless as I was at range anymore. Not that I'd need it to kick your ass." He charged as he spoke, crossing blades with him. He could see as Jinjo swung that he was trying to fire more beams at him, but by remaining this close, Ichigo could slash through them to turn them to ice with the Zanpakuto's power before they really got going, often even deflecting the small icicles created this way back at the Fullbringer with the returning swings of his sword. Jinjo growled and said, in a dark tone, "Facing me will be the last mistake you make, boy. When I'm done with you, there'll be nothing left." Then the man redoubled his efforts. Ichigo was forced to take a couple steps back by the sheer superior strength his enemy was putting into his strikes, but then he focused, calling up his own determination to strengthen his body with Hakuta, and the next time their blades clashed, Jinjo was the one sent skidding back. Ichigo then charged ahead, ready to deliver a finishing blow, but just as his blade was to strike it bounced back softly for a moment, as if it impacted a springy surface. Ichigo was so surprised that it took him a moment to realize he could have just powered through if he struck again, and before he could, Jinjo's sword let out a new, powerful beam that hit Ichigo straight in his belly, sending him flying. He crashed into the rooftops, smashing the concrete from the strength of the impact. Only the combination of being in his spiritual form and the fact he'd been reinforcing his body kept the wounds from being lethal, but he still felt stunned and out of it as he tried to get up. Before he'd even fully gotten to his knees, he saw Jinjo's massive shadow over him as the Fullbringer raised his weapon, and then Jinjo was sent down as a fast-moving, solid form slammed into his side with the strength and power of a cannonball, sending him smashing into the ground. Tatsuki smiled at Ichigo as she offered him a hand, and once he was back up, they both turned toward Jinjo, who was cleaning blood from his mouth with the back of his hand as he glared at them with pure hatred. "You're really an annoying fly, you know that, little girl." Tatsuki shrugged at that, raising her fists as she said, "I would rather a bee, if you don't mind, 'cause I'm looking forward to stinging you a whole lot." Then she nodded to Ichigo, who nodded back. They really could take him if they worked together, considering each of the two of them had been giving him a hard time on their own. Jinjo raised his eyebrows at that and commented, apparently unfazed. "Feeling confident, aren't you? But I suppose that's to be expected, when you have the numbers on your side." He paused, cocking his head, and then pointed with his thumb to a place behind his back as he continued. "But, are you sure it's me you should be tag teaming? Your friend there sure look like she'd need the help more, doesn't she?" Ichigo frowned for a moment, trying to understand what Jinjo was talking about, until he realized that, due to the way they'd moved around the battlefield, he could now see the rooftop where, he'd been expecting, Rukia should have defeated the big hollow and left to keep trailing the boy Yukio, except that's not what he saw. The blonde Fullbringer was nowhere to be seen, and Rukia wasn't fighting only the huge hollow he'd seen before, but also another one that looked like a black-robed man with dark hair from this distance, and from what he could see, she was losing. It was clear something wasn't right, as she seemed to freeze and only barely defend herself from the man whenever he attacked, and then the big hollow struck with what looked like a sharp tongue at her whenever she tried to get away from her opponent, cutting her. The Shinigami was bleeding in several places, and while Ichigo wasn't sure, it looked like one of her arms was moving stiffly, thus reducing her ability to use Kido. Ichigo was paralyzed with indecision for a moment, but then to his side Tatsuki spoke. "Go help her, if whatever that is can take Kukaki down. We can't beat it, even together, but perhaps if you're fighting alongside her, that'd be enough to win it. After all, you said you can kill hollows with just one strike, isn't it?" It wasn't that Ichigo didn't want to help Rukia, but he motioned with his head toward Jinjo. "What about him?" Tatsuki scoffed, slamming her fists together as she said, her tone and posture exuding confidence. "Don't worry about this guy, I'm gonna take him down and come save your ass in a few minutes at most." Ichigo couldn't help but chuckle at that, but he nodded and answered. "Alright then, I'll try not to kill the hollow too fast, so you can have some fun too." Then he was off, jumping high into the air and moving toward the roof where Rukia was fighting. Chapter 15, Bait. As he darted toward Rukia, Ichigo considered for a moment if he should strike for the big hollow first, but then shook his head. It was the humanoid one that was keeping Rukia on the ropes, so getting rid of that might be best. He ran toward his target with as much speed as Shunpo could give him, gravity adding a good deal to it. He went for a downward stab, but just before he could hit, the big hollow let out a shout, and the one that was harrying Rukia immediately darted back, moving fast enough to dodge both the falling blade and the small shockwave from his impact. Ichigo got back on his feet quickly, moving Sode no Shirayuki to a guard position as he waited for the dust raised by his landing to disperse and meanwhile said to Rukia, putting on his most self-assured attitude, "I hope you don't mind if I take this one off your hands." When he received no response, he turned to watch Rukia, puzzled, only to find that the Shinigami had a seriously shell-shocked expression on her face, and was clearly shaking. He glanced back to see if the enemy was moving. He could see its silhouette through the dust cloud, and didn't seem like it was in any hurry to go after them, and then moved closer to Rukia as he asked, trying to clear his own confusion. "Rukia? What's the matter, why does this hollow has you this shaken?" He turned back again as he waited for the answer, and then his eyes widened in surprise as he could now see that the opponent wasn't a hollow, or at least, it didn't look like one. He had a very normal human face rather than a mask. His eyes were normal ones, his face long and his chin pointed, and in his hand was a katana with a dark blue hilt in a rectangular crossguard. And of course, the clothes identified the guy quite clearly as a Shinigami. A Shinigami? Why is he fighting with them? Is he one of those spies you said? Rukia seemed to be shook by that, finally, as she answered, voice hesitant. "No, he's not a Shinigami, not anymore." "Ah, perhaps I could explain." Ichigo turned toward the massive hollow, who has lumbered somewhat closer, and let out a dark chuckle as he said, "You see, I have a very rare power among hollows. Instead of simply assimilating the souls of those I eat, I can create replicas of them, even access their memories. I can even give their own souls some small amount of control over these replicas, never enough to disobey me, of course, but enough for them to deliver some parting words. Isn't that right, Rukia dear?" Ichigo's eyes returned to Rukia, who was still shaking, and then to the dark-haired Shinigami who was still waiting on the other side. Ichigo lowered his voice, trying for a comforting tone as he asked, "Rukia, who is this?" Then, the Shinigami focused his eyes on Ichigo and said, in a harsh tone, "I am Kyan Shiba. I was Rukia's lieutenant, but then I was killed. Killed, because of her incompetence. I am but a slave to hollows, all because she was given a position she didn't deserve." Rukia took back a step as if she'd just been struck and murmured, in a desperate tone, "No, Kyan, please, believe me, I never wanted to." While Rukia was totally out of it, Ichigo wasn't, so he noticed a tentacle sprouting from one of the holes under the big hollow's eyes and darting to strike at Rukia. He intercepted it, parrying it off and even attempting to freeze it in place, but the contact was too brief, leaving only a small coat of ice over the appendage. The hollow didn't seem fazed by this, although he did look over the tentacle with some interest, before returning his gaze to Ichigo and commenting, "I recognize that sword you're wielding, Shinigami." It's dear Rukia's old sword, isn't it? Is this a new trick you Shinigami have developed, passing swords around? I'd believed them to be quite personal. Ichigo narrowed his glare at him, and said in a tone of challenge. Why don't you come and find out, Big Lug? The Hollow shrugged and answered, still appearing perfectly in control. Maybe I will, at some point. But, are you sure it is me you should be concentrating on? Ichigo was left perplexed for a moment, then his eyes widened as he turned and saw that Kaion Shiba, or at least his zombie or whatever this remnant of his was charging at Rukia, swinging at her with his sword. She was deflecting many strikes away by creating small barriers with her Kido, but even as she did, she was also speaking, her tone low enough that without paying attention, Ichigo had failed to hear her words. Kaion, please, stop. We can still solve this. I could try and find a solution, some way to free you from this hollow, please. The Shinigami, for his part, didn't seem moved at all, instead striking relentlessly as he said. You failed me already, I have no reason to trust you. You couldn't save me when I was alive, why should I believe you could do it now that I'm but a revenant? Seeing how Rukia was fighting, completely on the defensive, and often only stopping Kaion's sword by the barest margins, Ichigo decided he could deal with the big guy later, and instead just charged into Rukia's melee, just in time to block Kaion's sword with Sode no Shirayuki and send him skidding backwards. That caused Rukia to turn at him with confusion written all over her face. Ichigo. He grinned at her, then said. Look, I can see this isn't easy for you, but you have your cages, don't you? We've been fighting to capture before, just do that with him as well, and we'll see if we can save your friend later. I'll keep him occupied, you just make sure the big guy doesn't sneak up on us and try to capture Kaion when you have a shot. And then, without giving her any chance to hesitate or argue any more, Ichigo darted forward, crossing sword with the former Shinigami once more. The guy looked at him passively, eyes cold and no real emotion on his face. The rage he'd displayed early when facing Rukia completely disappeared. Ichigo pressed him with a series of sudden strikes and the guy gave ground, preferring to dodge backwards and only deflect attacks that came too close rather than trying to go on the offensive. Ichigo frowned, that felt wrong. While it wasn't the only way to handle a sword fight, keeping the opponent under pressure was always the best approach, and dictating the tempo of the fight, which this Kaion was letting him do without opposition, would almost always lead to victory, unless the attacker made a mistake that his opponent was able to capitalize on. It seemed strange for a Shinigami to fight in this manner, as if hoping that Ichigo would make a mistake. He supposed it was possible that Kaion was just a bad swordsman, although that did raise the question of why he wasn't using some of the other Shinigami abilities, if he was better at those. Then Kaion spoke, sounding uninterested in his own question as he said. Who are you? My name is Ichigo Kurosaki, and I'm starting to think that you aren't the real Kaion Shiba, nor actually a Shinigami at all. Rukia was too shocked to notice, but your swordsmanship barely at beginner level. I think even the crappiest of Shinigami would have more skill than this. Well, aren't we a smart boy? Why yes, my boy, I am in fact not Kaion Shiba. Ichigo's breath itched for a moment as Kaion's voice changed in pitch and intensity, sounding female and familiar. Then, as his opponent stepped back once more, its free hand went to its head, grabbing its hairs and removing them. His entire body seemed to transform as he did, and then it was no longer a he, but rather a she, a tall woman with long, wavy brown hairs and warm brown eyes which smiled at Ichigo with a familiarity that caused him to be frozen in surprise. It's me, Ichigo, don't you recognize me? Mom. Instinctively, Ichigo took a step back as, in front of him, his mother did the same, and he was about to flung at her when suddenly another voice shouted straight into his ears, in a panicked tone. Step back, you idiot. Now. Ichigo followed Sode no Shirayuki's command almost by reflex, and that was the only thing that saved him as the sword, which had still been in his mother's hand, only opened a gash into his belly instead of completely disemboweling him. He stumbled back, hand on his belly in disbelief even as, in front of him, what looked in everything like Masaka Kurosaka pouted. Even the pout was right, he could remember seeing it so many times. And said, sounding disappointed. Ichigo, is that any way to greet your mother? Why won't you come give me a hug instead? You're not my mother, she never would have. Let you die? But you did let me die, Ichigo, or did you forgot? No, that wasn't me, that was Dash. She interrupted him again, with a wave of her hands as she said. It's fine, I'll forgive you, that's what mothers do. But first, you need to come to me, once we're both dead, we can finally be together as spirits, the way we should have been for so long. Ichigo shook his head again, taking another 2 steps again as he said. No, this is a trick, the hollow can read mind, somehow, and... Oh, did I fail to introduce myself, Kurosaki? Ichigo turned toward the big hollow, to see that the grin on its mask had grown bigger as he said. They call me the Grand Fisher, maybe you know the name. I collected your mother, the same way I did with Kukaki Rukia's friend. They are both equally real. Ichigo was left speechless by that, and then the figure that looked like his mother lunged for him, moving to skewer him. Ichigo turned, but he was slow, half because of the surprise and half because he didn't want to hurt her, and then, a golden barrier appeared in her path, and as the sword only struck at that, Rukia was there, next to him, dragging him up in the air with herself as she said, apologetic. Sorry, I wasn't sure what was going on, and when to strike. I understand. This trickery, how is it reading our mind? Rukia shook her head and answered, grim. I don't think it is, he would have stopped me from saving you otherwise, wouldn't he? But then. Rukia nodded. It's really as he say, that's Grand Fisher's power. He uses those he eats as lures for their closest family, and then repeats it again and again. He's one of the oldest and most powerful hollows around, he's been active for over 3 centuries, and has killed multiple Shinigami lieutenants. Ichigo frowned. That sounded worrisome, but in the end, it changed nothing. So what do you want to do? He's keeping your friend and, my mother, trapped, or he killed them, or however that works. I've no plan of letting it go. Rukia seemed to regain some resolve at that, and answered. Neither do I, don't worry. I say we follow your plan, we cage the bait, then take Grand Fisher down. Hard. Ichigo nodded at that, he couldn't make himself smile at the idea of bringing the fight to the monster, but there was some grim satisfaction at the idea of having a definitive clash with the hollow who'd been responsible for his mother missing from his life for so long. Rukia nodded back, and then sent 3 of her giant spheres to the figure on the ground. Ichigo tried not to think about how it looked like his friend was straight up attacking his mother, and instead charged at the huge hollow beneath them. The enemy struck with multiple tentacles, but Ichigo dove straight into them while slashing his sword around himself to create a ring of ice which deflected them all away as he dove through, landing straight in front of the hollow. He struck forward, causing Grand Fisher to dart backwards in response. Ichigo pressed on, parrying one of the tentacles away, cutting another, and then charging in with another slash, leaving a deep gash into the monster's arm. Grand Fisher punched him with his other hand. The hit was very powerful and pushed Ichigo backwards, but thanks to Hakuta, he'd been able to harden his body with determination just before it, and so he was able to charge back in without pause. Having gained some distance, Grand Fish found countering with his tentacles much easier to do, but Ichigo was still making progress. Then, suddenly a giant golden sphere slammed into Grand Fisher from behind, making him stumble. He still managed to avoid a stab to his mask, which was impressive, considering the thing was as large as the rest of his whole body, but nevertheless Ichigo managed to wound the hollow deeply before it could retreat. And then, said retreat was stopped when Grand Fish slammed into a large barrier Rukia had built behind him. Once more, he had to take a hit from Ichigo, blocking it with his forearm, resulting in a pretty deep cut to it, before he could deliver a punch powerful enough with one of the fist on his back legs to destroy the barrier and retreat further back. At this point, Ichigo finally was able to grin with challenge at the hollow, as the teamwork between himself and Rukia was clearly putting it on the back foot. He charged once more, but this time Grand Fisher countered with a single tentacle striking at them, although one that seemed to have a larger round head instead of the spear-like one every other had before. Ichigo ignored this, just striking directly at the tentacle to cut through it, except he found that the sword was struck and, as he watched, he realized the large globe at the end of the tentacle had changed, growing into a human figure that, a moment later, completed itself into the image of Ichigo's mother again, except one with his sword struck inside her head. The sight left him in sudden shock, and once more it was only Sode no Shirayuki's sudden warning that had him get out of range before the Masaki in front of him could stab him. The simulacrum of Ichigo's mother let out a sigh, even as the cut on her head slowly knitted itself together, and said, "Ichigo, is that really what you want to do? It hurts, you know." While Ichigo was left unable to react, Rukia struck, but Masaki disconnected herself from the tentacle which had remained attached to her head otherwise, dodging Rukia's flung spheres of glowing fire. Then, another tentacle, this time the one connected to the top of Grand Fisher's mask instead of one of those that were housed under his eyes, sprouted another egg which quickly developed into the image of Kyan Shiba, looking up at Rukia with disdain and disgust even as Masaki started to head toward Ichigo. Rukia looked stricken for a moment, then she shook her head and shouted, "Ichigo, I'll take yours if you take mine." Without need to having it said to him twice, Ichigo charged at Kyan, slamming into him and sending him crashing to the ground, as he clearly wasn't able to walk on air the way Ichigo could. Once more they crossed sword, but before two exchanges had gone through, Ichigo saw the figure morph in front of himself and, once again, he found himself facing Masaki as his mother pouted to him and said, "This is like the time with the cookies, isn't it?" Ichigo couldn't connect what she was saying for a moment, and she went on. "You're trying to protect your friend the way you took the punishment for Karen when she'd stolen the cookies." Ichigo's eyes narrowed at that and he said, "I never told Mom about that." "No, but you protested your punishment that one time. You never did for the punishments you got when you actually deserved them. Did you really think I didn't notice?" That left Ichigo shocked once more, as he realized she was right, and that this wasn't something he, himself, had known. How could Grand Fisher be able to fake something like this? This time, Sode no Shirayuki didn't even send a warning. Instead, he could feel the sword directing his arm by itself, to stop another thrust from the figure in front of him, but without his active collaboration, the parry was slow and clumsy, and he still got a wound to his side as he took a few steps back. His mother looked up at Ichigo with sadness and asked, in a pleading tone, "Why do you keep this up, Ichigo? Wouldn't it be easier to stop this?" Ichigo grimaced, as his eyes settled on the huge hollows who was watching, and grinning, from behind Masaki's image. He couldn't surrender, and yet, he didn't think he could really put all his strength into this fight, either, not when his enemy really seemed to be holding his mom hostage. Tatsuki watched Ichigo get away, and saw that Jinjo was doing the same. Then the guy turned back to face her and said, with a smug grin, even as he finished getting up and placed the sword in a resting position atop his shoulder, "So, you can take me, you said? Are you really sure about that?" She actually wasn't. She still doubted her skills with her new abilities, but like hell was she going to give the guy any satisfaction on the matter? Besides, she might be new to spirit fighting, but trash-talking arrogant kung fu guys? That, she'd been doing for long enough to know the moves on her sleeve. "Please. I'd do it with one hand tied behind my back, but you've been enough of an ass to my friends. I've decided you don't deserve a sporting chance. I hope you're ready for the trashing of your life." And then, without waiting for the answer, but making sure he was about to say something, and thus would have his guard down, she charged, already focusing on her determination to be able to both tank any blow he had ready and deliver some serious hurt once she could land a hit. To his credit, Jinjo switched from whatever he'd been about to say to a defensive position quite fast, slashing down with his sword while making it fire a number of beams along its path. She could see his game even as she dodged. With how high the burst had gone, she could not jump over it, only take to one of the sides. He was curtailing her options. Tatsuki grinned as she took to the right, which caused Jinjo a split second of hesitation. The left had more open space between the barrier of beams and the rooftop's edge, so he'd expected her to dodge that side, which let her gain a few precious meters before he followed up with the obvious move, slashing out to the right to fan out a wider spread of beams meant to completely cover the area while she couldn't dodge. She jumped down the side of the building right as he fired, then stuck herself to the vertical surface by drawing on her friendship and affection for Orium, and proceeded to wall run her way onward, and as soon as the beams stopped, she pushed herself upwards, reverting to her strongest determination to once more shroud herself into a field as hard as stone. The maneuver had clearly left Jinjo surprised, but Tatsuki was still not close enough to take him down. She was, however, perfectly positioned for a devastating heel drop on the roof that cracked a solid slab out of it, which she then proceeded to punch with as much disgust as possible, sending it flying straight at Jinjo's face. Her enemy slashed the projectile down with his sword, but it was enough of a distraction for Tatsuki to get right next to him and strike with a fist of rage, shouting out the most powerful jet of spiritual fire she could. Jinjo recoiled, but it seemed that whatever he did which made him so durable, it also made him somewhat fireproof, in that his hairs were badly singed and his face was left with light scorch marks, but it wasn't on fire. He swung blindly and wildly in her direction, his sight still recovering from the sudden flash of her attack, which Tatsuki dodged by dropping to the ground and then pushing forward with as much determination as possible, smashing into Jinjo's belly with a shoulder tackle while using a raising elbow strike, combined with a sudden push of disdain, to send the sword flying behind herself while toppling Jinjo to the ground. With a shout of triumph, she went to deliver the finishing blow with a punch downwards, except Jinjo seemed to bounce back from the ground, faster than any recover she'd ever seen before and without even using his legs, as if the ground itself was pushing him back upwards rather than his muscles doing it. It was sudden enough to send Tatsuki flying backwards. She rolled with it, going to her feet and into a guard position, just in time for Jinjo's fist to slam into her crossed arms. The sudden acceleration he seemed to have gotten combined with whatever reinforcing technique he was using enough to make it painful despite how much focused she was on just winning at any cost. The man grinned at that, and commented, "You are clever, I'll give you that, but you're just a rank beginner. I've been doing this for almost 20 years, I've been in bad positions before, and against one like you, I won't even need my sword to win. Let me show you what a Fullbringer can accomplish, and you'll regret thinking me easily beaten." Tatsuki glared at him through her crossed arms and answered, trying to sound as self-assured as she could, putting the determination in her voice much as she had on her body. "We'll see about that, I'm not as green as you think, I've been a fighter for years too. This is just a new style I'm learning, nothing more, and I couldn't hope for a better test dummy. Come at me then." Jinjo jumped backwards as she uncrossed her arms to push him away, and as she charged, let out a long, drawn-out breath, and that when Tatsuki suddenly found herself as if she was wading through pitch, as the fist she'd been aiming at his head traveled at barely a tenth of the speed she had been expecting it to, while Jinjo dodged to the side with impossibly fast reflexes, as if using a springboard to get on her left and deliver a powerful direct straight to her cheek. The hit sent her slamming into the ground, and she hardened her determination mid-flight to avoid getting hurt, except that, when she hit it, instead of leaving a crater or anything of the like, she felt as if she'd landed into a sand bed. Which wouldn't have been bad, as it didn't hurt as much, except when she tried to get up, she felt that she could find no traction, as if she was being dragged down by quicksand. Her eyes widened as she saw Jinjo coming for her with another straight punch, and she desperately waved in hand with as much disgust as she could, the wave of charged Ryutsu sending him flying backwards. Thinking quickly, she slammed both her hands into the ground beneath her with a similar charge to send herself away from the trap, but as she did, she found Jinjo was already coming back for her, as if having bounced back from the attack in midair. She still managed to place at least an arm in between to soften the blow, but was nevertheless blown back by it. She righted herself as she could to brace for landing, but Jinjo landed a moment before her with one hand flat on the ground, and when her feet touched the roof, they kept skidding, as if there was no friction at all on the surface, only the rooftop's fence stopped her from sliding straight down the building. Jinjo, on the other hand, didn't seem bothered by it at all, as she saw him charging forward, and then she realized he was bouncing on air rather than touching the ground, whereas Tatsuki couldn't even stand straight as her feet kept failing to find any purchase due to the lack of friction. Eyes widening as Jinjo got ever close, she tried to focus on the sense of detachment that Yoriuki had said was the key for achieving a superior resistance to rock, to gain the hardness and sharpness of steel. It didn't come to her naturally, but she thought she could manage it on just her arm, and once she was sure she had it, she stabbed with it straight through the rooftop's fence, her arm going through all the way to the elbow. She could feel it hurting and see a bit of blood on it, clear sign she still hadn't managed it perfectly, but it didn't matter, because it gave her the leverage she needed, and as Jinjo got within range to strike at her, she used it to heave herself upwards in a double raising kick, letting loose all of her fury and hatred for her opponent and this situation he'd put her into. The crescent wave of spiritual fire let out from the attack that engulfed the charging Fullbringer was genuinely satisfying to witness. Still, She knew from her previous punch of rage that it wouldn't be enough to take him down, so, while he retreated backward, dark smoke raising from all over his body, she used the time to crouch on top of the fence, freeing her arm from it but keeping a solid grip still. She needed to charge at him faster than she had so far. The way he was clearly altering the area around him to his advantage meant she couldn't leave him any time to set up, but she didn't have the air walking or speed technique Ichigo had shown her, which meant she'd need to improvise. Tatsuki grinned at her crazed idea, then concentrated all of her rage into her feet, and kicked straight at the fence, even as she let go of it the very moment of the impact. The sheer exhilaration as she was flung forward by the explosion she'd detonated at her feet was enough to let her power through the pain in her legs. She'd switched the hardening technique on her legs as soon as she'd let out the fire, but clearly either her timing or the determination she'd been using to fuel it hadn't been good enough to completely neuter the damage of being at an explosion's ground zero. And now, she was moving with the speed of a literal missile, gaining ground on Jinjo so fast she saw his eyes widening in disbelief and feet even as she cocked the punch that would surely end him. He waved a hand hurriedly in front of himself, and Tatsuki could feel the air resistance to her movement increasing, almost like it had become an elastic barrier trying to bounce her back, but she was moving with the strength of a rocket, and while the effect slowed her down considerably, she nevertheless punched through, her acceleration just too much to be stopped. Jinjo fell to the ground in disbelief as she closed in on him, and then, just as her fist was about to connect, she grinned. And when her hand hit, rather than his smug face, it was a hard bar of solid steel. She stood there for a moment, as she realized that Jinjo hadn't been retreating blindly, he'd been going back to where his sword was laying on the ground, before the man said to her, a crazed tone in his voice. "That almost got me, you madwoman, but now this fight is over." And then, before she could react in any way other than hardening herself as much as possible, scores of laser beam erupted from the flat of the blade that her hands was currently resting on, each individual one smashing into her with the power of a truck. Tatsuki was bowled over almost immediately, and pinned to the ground a moment later as the assault didn't relent at all. She could feel the hits even through her armor, and as they continued without pause, she could almost feel her determination starting to almost crack. If he kept this up, she wouldn't even have time to breathe. And then, just as she thought she wouldn't be able to take any more, Jinjo stopped, but she realized that was only because, as he kept up his onslaught, he'd slowly been moving closer, and had not the tip of his sword placed squarely on her sternum, keeping her pinned down and making it clear that if she tried anything, he'd restart his energy attacks, except this time it'd be at point-blank range and she'd be unable to evade them at all. He glared down at her, a very smug and threatening grin on his face, and went on. "So, is there anything you want me to tell Kurosaka before I kill you? I feel like he'd like hearing your last words, it'd be a nice parting gift." Tatsuki spat in his face and answered, angry. "You'd just use anything I say against him when you fight, to make him lose concentration at the right moment. I know your type, and you'll get nothing out of me." Jinjo's grin turned to annoyance at that as he spat back. "So be it, then, you might not look like one, but those were Shinigami powers you were using, I've seen them in action before. And I stopped sparing Shinigami lives a long, long time ago." Tatsuki had no idea if there was anything else she could do, so she did the first thing she could think of, grabbing the sword before Jinjo could fire as she shouted, trying to psyche herself up to make the attack work. "Then I'll take you down with me." It was not easy at all, to call up excitement when all she wanted to feel was despair, but she managed to muster just enough at the thought that she'd at least keep Ichigo from having to fight this bastard, and then let the electricity loose all over her body and, thanks to the sword connecting them, all over Jinjo's as well. The light show a terrifying sight as for a moment it made everything within her field of vision glow in shades of light gray and blinding white. Then she let go, and her enemy stumbled backwards, falling to the ground a moment later. He ended up in a half-sitting, half-crouching position, while Tatsuki, now that she no longer had his huge sword pinning her to the ground, went to get up, although she only managed to go to one knee, and even then, the spasms from how much electricity she'd run through her own body made it clear to her she wasn't going to be able to fight again anytime soon. Still, she moved her eyes on Jinjo, satisfied she'd at least stopped the guy as well, except when she watched, she saw that, slowly but surely, using his sword like a crutch, he was climbing to his feet. He had electrical burns all over, and she could see he was having spasms as well. His left leg in particular seemed to not want to sustain his weight, and he kept squinting the right eye as if trying to shake away something from it, but nevertheless, he could move, and if he could do that, he could fight. Indeed, Jinjo glared at her with his one remaining good eye, and growled, vengeful. You, crazy, bitch. I'm going to murder you. His sword started to glow, as if charging up for a beam. Apparently the wounds had been enough that now he needed some time to shoot one instead of firing them quickly, but that was hard comfort when she couldn't put up a defense any longer, so that just one was sure to kill her. She still would try to tank it, of course, calling forward all of her determination to not let the Fullbringer get the last laugh, and then, suddenly, a blast of glowing blue light slammed into Jinjo, smashing him back on the rooftops floor while sending his sword flying out of his grip. The Fullbringer stood still for a moment, then tried to get up again on trembling limbs, only for another blast of blue light to smash him down. He took two more, before finally stopping any attempt at getting up again, and by then Tatsuki's eyes had moved to the sky, where she could see the immaculate figure of Ishida, standing on top of one of his hovering platforms of blue light and glaring down at Jinjo with absolute disdain. Once he was sure their enemy wouldn't try to move any longer, Ishida moved with such speed Tatsuki couldn't follow him, and then was at her side, slowly helping her to her feet as he asked, his tone neutral. I am glad that you survived, Arisawa. These Fullbringers can be a bit tricky to put down. She looked disbelieving at him. She'd lost, he was the only reason she was alive, and he called them tricky? But then Ishida added, even as he created a light construct similar to a chair and sat her on it. Where is everybody else, do you know? Tatsuki nodded, and answered between coughs, that electrical discharge had done a number on her organs too, it seemed. Orium and Sato were fighting the other three Fullbringers, Ichigo and Kukaki are fighting a hollow there. She pointed, which caused Ishida to narrow his eyes as he said, in a mutter. That's the strongest hollow I've ever seen, they'll need my help. Then he looked at her and added, his question sounding surprisingly neutral. Arisawa, you did enough for now, that hollow won't be as easy as this Fullbringer was, and you are wounded. But waiting here is dangerous, the Fullbringer could recover at any time. Do you want me to protect you myself, or would you rather I leave you in some safe place before I go help Kurosaki and Kukaki? Tatsuki really didn't want Ichigo to see the condition in which a single enemy, who apparently Ishida thought was easy to beat, had reduced her, but she wanted him to get hurt even less, so she swallowed her pride and said, mustering all of her remaining determination. Bring me along, I might not have much fight left in me, but I think I could just manage one good strike still, if I get the chance. Ishida seemed to accept her self-evaluation, and connected her chair to his own platform, before they were off to join Ichigo and Rukia in their fight. Rukia took a few steps back as Kaien advanced on her. In hindsight, it was stupid to expect that Grand Fisher could be defeated as easily as simply having a comrade who wasn't as affected by the bait he had brought up take that one on. He wouldn't have been able to kill as many as he had if he could be beaten so easily. Still, she had to at least try something. She could see that Ichigo was in the same situation she'd been earlier, barely managing to defend himself while his mother kept attacking him and the Grand Fisher let out the occasional whipping tentacle in his direction whenever he tried to fully disengage, clearly not wanting him to take advantage of his shunpo to get some distance. She, at least, was not having that problem, in part because of the barriers she'd seated in the air between herself and the big hollow, but also because she'd not landed at any point during the battle, and Kaien seemed unwilling to follow her in the air. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was due to just not being able to because of how Grand Fisher had put together the fake body he was into, or maybe because he'd realized it wasn't necessary. After all, he was hurting her enough just by speaking. You know it was your fault, Rukia. Your desire to show yourself worthy of the rank, to prove that it hadn't just been given to you due to your family, is why you lead the team into the ambush. If you hadn't, Miyako would not have had to come to your rescue, and neither would I. She shouted back, trying to muster the strength to strike down at her former friend by sprouting justifications she didn't believe in. It wasn't for that, it wasn't. I was trying to make the right call, not feed my ego. I wasn't. Kaien's answer was pitiless as he answered. Does it matter? We'd both still be alive, but for your arrogance. You thought you had skills you lacked. You're no leader, never were, and never will be. Rukia wanted to shout at him that it wasn't true, that she could be a leader still, but she couldn't, not when she'd been avoiding as much responsibility as she could the last 2 years since it happened, not when she had asked for a transfer to the 12th Division because Captain Zyuka takeoffer of Kayan's old rank of lieutenant had felt like a slap in the face, as if she was being rewarded for having caused her mentor's death, when even her latest attempt at leading in such a low-stake environment as the mortal realm had almost resulted into her entire team being annihilated by a small handful of enemies who were barely on par with a mid-level hollow or a unseated Shinigami officer in terms of power. Sensing her lack of reaction to his mockery, Kayan took a step forward as he continued, in a dark, vengeful tone. You know I'm right, you've always known. You deserve to suffer the same as we are, so stop running and come down here, let yourself be punished alongside the rest of us. Rukia could feel herself almost giving up, but she knew that would solve nothing as she shouted out. Even if I'm guilty, that would change nothing. We can destroy this hollow, and save you both from the hell he's keeping you in. Please, fight with me instead. Grand Fisher's laughter echoed throughout the air at that, as it mocked Rukia for her request. He has no ability to do that. His mind might be his own, but his body is fully mine, and he can do nothing with it unless I approve of it first. He could no longer defy me than my fingers could. And even if I could, I would not fight at your side. When I last did, it cost me my life. You deserve no help from me. And everything I gave you before, I would take back if I could. Those words hurt harder than any physical attack could have, more painful than a boulder smashing in her ribs, as Rukia couldn't help but recall all of the friendship Kayan had offered her, the joke, the lessons, the treating her as an equal, and the idea that it had all been wasted time to him. It was too much to bear. She could feel herself tearing up, as she tried and failed to figure something she could do, when suddenly, a scream drew her attention in. She turned, to see what looked like a small, flaming meteor falling from the sky to smash straight into Ichigo Kurosaka's mother, sending her reeling backwards, ripping one of her arms apart, and setting her on fire, even as the meteor continued to scream for one more moment before the flames finally settled down. Rukia's eyes widened at seeing the condition Tatsuki was in. The girl was bruised, battered and burned on any visible piece of her body, while her clothes were a tattered ruin and blood marred her all over. Even still, despite the fact she clearly couldn't move, she had enough strength left to speak, and in fact shout, while glaring at Ichigo with a fury that had clearly been what was fueling the fire she'd previously been under. What are you doing, you moron? You're fighting worse than a preschool kid. You were supposed to leave me something to contribute to, not let me have to do all the work myself. Ichigo looked stunned at that, but the disarmed Masaki had turned on Tatsuki with a hateful glare as she said. I don't know who you are, but I'm so going to make you pay for dash. If you can't even remember who I am, I'm not going to take any of your usual scolding either, old woman. Now stop being a bother. That stopped Masaki short, but behind her, Ichigo had lowered his head, as something dark and dangerous that looked very much like hatred seemed to blaze through his eyes. You don't know who she is? Are you sure about that? Because you really, really should. Masaki slowly turned to watch Ichigo, expression unreadable as the boy straightened, glaring at his mother as he placed the index of his free hand next to his forehead as he said. Come on, if you can't remember her, maybe you can read her name out of my head? I'm thinking of it right now. Shouldn't be too hard, right? Just say her name. Can't you? As he received no answer, Ichigo shook his head and said, almost growling. So that's how it is. You don't really have their minds, do you? Nor can you read ours, for that matter. You just managed to steal some of their memories back when you killed them, somehow, but that's all you have. A small number of tricks and a lot of smoke and mirrors to cover up your lies. Rukia's eyes widened at Ichigo's comment, and as she refocused her attention on the suddenly silent Kayan in front of her, she realized he had to be right. That was why Kayan wasn't fighting, because the Hollow had no idea how to make him fight. And while he'd been capable of saying a lot of personal stuff, most of it he could have learned during their last fight, not to mention by context from having eaten almost her entire squad. The monster probably realized that she too, like Ichigo, has seen through his trick, as Kayan opened his mouth to speak again, but Rukia didn't let him. She made a swiping motion with her arm while snapping her fingers in a complicated rhythm that she'd committed to memory a long time ago, and the puppet was surrounded into an inescapable golden cage, which a moment later simply vanished from existence. She could feel her muscles sagging from the effort, but for once, Rukia really didn't care. The reason she didn't normally use Kido that powerful so casually, and rather saved it for emergencies, especially now that she didn't have her Zanpakuto to fall back on, it was the combination of how draining it was, and how disastrously it could wrong if miscast. And even so, completely banishing from existence the mockery of her friend felt more right than anything she'd done in a long time. Grand Fisher let out a dark chuckle, and Rukia saw that Ichigo had similarly caught his fake mother in a cage of ice and was advancing on the hollow the same way she was. Despite this, their enemy didn't seem intimidated at all as he sprouted all of his tentacles, each one with a new egg on their tops as he said, "You might have managed to find the will to fight my revenant baits, but I can field a whole army of them if needed. You didn't really think that I defeated as many enemies as I did just by tricking people with illusions, did you?" Ichigo and Rukia both started to run at the hollow, but she could see they wouldn't get to it before the eggs on the tentacles had finished opening, but before they could, each egg was destroyed by arrows of blue energy striking unerringly from the sky. Then Ishida commented, in a very matter-of-fact tone, "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that Shinigami had trouble with what a Quincy can do easily." The Grand Fisher looked surprised at the attack, which allowed Ichigo, who was closer, to reach it and slash at its mask, cutting it in two. However, instead of drawing the hollow away as a strike to the mask normally would, the body simply parted into white paste, falling to the ground in separated halves. Rukia and Ichigo both looked at it with clear perplexity before hearing the chuckle of Grand Fisher raising from a different angle of the rooftop. As they turned, Rukia realized that, during the battle, they'd completely lost sight of the first revenant puppet, and that was what slowly rose from its position on the ground, wearing a look that seemed like a mix of Kaien and Masaki. "You did pretty well, I must admit. And since I feel like my purpose here has been accomplished, and you've been delayed enough, I think for once I will look for an easier meal, and leave you be." Even as he spoke, his form had slowly changed, reshaping itself back into his huge body, and then he jumped with incredible strength, getting back to the rooftop where, Rukia saw, he collected Jinjo's unconscious body before ripping open a tear in reality which he escaped into. Ichigo moved next to Rukia at that, with a frown on his face as he said, "So we failed then?" Rukia paused, then shook her head, a tired smile growing on her face as she said, "No, we haven't. I might not have been able to follow Yukio, but since we knew that could happen, we hid a tracer in his game console. If we make it back to Kisuk, we should be able to track him down." She then moved to use what healing Kido she still had energy for on Tatsuki. Even as she did, however, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread mounting within her. Grand Fisher had been toying with her emotions, that much was obvious now, but he had still had a point. She was no leader material, and once again she'd only managed to make it through thanks to luck, and with Tatsuki once more far more wounded than she should have been. Rukia could only hope she wouldn't mess things again like this against Hirako Shinji. If she made a mistake against an opponent of his caliber, she feared luck would be enough to get her new team through it in one piece. Jinjo's recovery was faster than Grand Fisher had expected. As soon as they weren't in the mortal realm anymore, he got back to his own feet, even if he had to use his sword as a crutch. Then, he turned toward the hollow with an accusatory tone, pointing a finger at him as he said, "What was that at the end? I might have been unable to move, but I could see quite all right. I've seen you pop up those clones of yours much faster than that, and that's without considering you could morph each of them into your real form and keep the army growing exponentially. And you let that Quincy kid hit you. You were static almost the entire battle instead of teleporting through your tentacles the way you did when you took down 6 of his kind at the same time you decimated my old team." Grand Fisher let his grin grow larger at that, and deflected with an amused tone. "Why, I am honored you have such a great esteem of my abilities. Truly it is wonderful to receive such praise. Don't fuck with me, monster. You could have killed them all any time you wanted, but you let them escape." "Now, that's just not true. I could have killed some of them, certainly, maybe even all 4, but not without getting hurt, and both of the 2 I faced were far more skilled than the average Shinigami. I just did the sensible thing and didn't take useless risks. How would it have been useless to destroy enemies who've gotten in my way so many times? That's because we need them alive." Jinjo turned suddenly at the voice behind himself, but then scoffed as the familiar figure of a tall Shinigami with long, wavy black hairs and a small scar next to his left eyes and said, turning around. "What game are you playing now, Grand Fisher? I'm getting tired of this." Jinzhou's eyes then widened, and he jumped backwards as the Zanpakuto struck for him, managing to avoid anything but a minor nick to his cheek that left a thin red line under his eyes. The Fullbringer looked in surprised. He'd been hit enough times by both Hollows and Shinigami's Zanpakuto that he could tell the difference between the two. His eyes widening, he whispered. How did you get here?" The Shinigami cocked his head to the right. Grand Fisher had took a lot of effort to replicate that particular movement in the occasional copies he made of the man, since he had to use memories of others seeing it, rather than the much better recollections he got when eating the person he was mimicking itself, and then said to Jinzhou, in a confused tone. "Don't you recognize me anymore, Jinzhou? This is all part of our plan, remember? You came up with it yourself." Jinzhou's eyes were filled with confusion for a moment, but then they widened in understanding as he took a few steps forwards and said, "Of course. I'm sorry, Tsukushima, it took me a moment to recover the memories you'd removed, but now." Grand Fisher let out an annoyed grunt, and his sharpened tentacles slashed together at once in the blink of an eye, tearing the Fullbringer apart thanks to how Tsukushima had made him lower his guard. Then he said to the Shinigami, feeling very amused at it all. "Not that I mind the meal, but I want you to tell Lord Jin that I still think this was a waste." Tsukushima shrugged. "I told you already, I can only insert myself into the memories of those I wound while my Shikai is released. The moment I seal it, the real memories will reassert themselves, and unlike Captain Ichimaru, I cannot keep my Shikai constantly released for as long as I want to. He's the only Shinigami I know who can actually do that. Yes, you've told me a million times, but I still think I could have manipulated this idiot into doing our bidding for a bit longer. We're gonna need all the help we can get, if we are to recover the Hujioku before our enemies do." Tsukushima shook his head. "It'd have been pointless, even if you'd managed to justify to him you're not killing Rukia and her team. He'd have remained suspicious, and if he figured something out at the wrong time, might have completely derailed the plans. Much better to get rid of him now, before he can become a problem." Grand Fisher shrugged as he started to eat the Fullbringer remains, even as he asked. "So, what next? Letting your little friends flush out the thief was a good plan, but if Soul Society gets their hand on it, things will become far more complex. Don't you worry about that, plans are already in motion, including in case we fail to steal it ourselves. In the end, just follow our instructions, and victory will be ours." Check the description for the links to the author.